Set it there. Thorne pointed to the cleared space on the iron work table, carefully avoiding the wet patch where the carrier's boots had leaked puddles onto the stone flags. The man grunted, heaving the wooden case down with a thud that vibrated up through the soles of Thorne's shoes and settled somewhere deep in his ankles. It was a heavy thing, bound in rope that had seen more salt than fresh water, the fibers swollen and dark against the pale pine of the box. Signed for? The carrier asked, wiping his hands on trousers that smelled of horse and old tobacco. Eventually. Thorne stepped closer, but did not touch the wood immediately, preferring to let the journey from Pevensey end completely before he began his own part of this grim transit. The mortuary air usually held the sharp, clean sting of carbolic and formaldehyde, a scent that scrubbed the lungs, yet now something else drifted up from the crate. It was sweet and cloying, like fruit left too long in a closed pantry, distinct from the brine that crusted the corners. Railway took its time, the carrier said, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Said the line was blocked near Eastbourne, signals down. Delays happen. Not with a box like this, not usually. The man leaned in, voice dropping to a rough whisper that scraped against the quiet of the room. They handled it rough, mate, saw them loading it at the station, dropped it once, heard the shift inside. Thorne's head snapped up. You heard a shift. Like bones knocking, or stones, didn't ask questions. The carrier pulled a cigarette from behind his ear, but didn't light it, rolling the unburnt tobacco between thumb and forefinger as if seeking comfort in the ritual. Just want the signature, gotta run to Wandsworth next. Wait. Thorne pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket, the brass rim cold against his palm, and leaned over the lid. The official seal of the Sussex coroner was there, red wax stamped with the county crest, but the edge was wrong. Someone had broken it. Someone had melted new wax over the old, a hasty repair job that lacked the precision of a court officer. The new wax was uneven, rippling like fat cooled too quickly on a broth, and it held that same sweet, sickly odor that rose from the wood grain. This seal has been tampered with, Thorne said, keeping his voice flat. Railway men, like I said, rough. This is not rough handling, this is reopening. Thorne traced the edge of the wax with a fingernail, feeling the brittle flake of the old layer beneath the new. Who applied this wax? Attempt 1. Didn't see, wasn't me, as the carrier took a step back. It implies contamination. Imply what you like, I've got a schedule. The man's eyes darted towards the door, towards the grey light of the April morning that leaked through the high, grime-streaked windows. Rain's starting again. Canvas isn't waterproof. Thorne ignored him. He focused on the smell. It clung to the wax, distinct from the salt air of the Sussex coast, a specific scent of decay that had managed to survive the journey wrapped in wood and rope. He made a note of it in his head, a private annotation beside the official record. Odor present, source unclear, attributed to damp. He dismissed it as mere atmospheric moisture from the coast, a trick of the sea air mixing with the pine resin, because to acknowledge it as anything else would require stopping the process, would require calling a superior, would require admitting that the evidence was already compromised before it reached his table. Sign here. Thorne pushed the ledger across the table, the leather cover slick with moisture from the air. The carrier grabbed the pen, scrawled a name that looked like a fence line, and handed it back. That is it. Good. The man backed away, eager to leave the room, eager to leave the weight of the box behind. Don't open it all at once, might spill. He was gone before Thorne could reply, the door slamming shut with a rattle of the frame. The noise vanished quickly, absorbed by the thick walls and the heavy silence of the mortuary. Thorne stood alone with the crate. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched the wax. Under his nails, embedded in the cuticles, was a fine grit, shingle, coarse particles from the Pevensey beach that had worked their way into the wood, into the wax, and now onto his skin. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, feeling the abrasive texture, but no amount of rubbing removed the sensation. It felt ground in, permanent. He walked to the porcelain basin in the corner. The tap groaned when he turned it, spitting brown water before clearing to a cold stream. He pumped the carbolic soap dispenser, the mechanical hiss loud in the room, and began to scrub. The water ran grey over his hands, carrying away the surface dirt, but the grit remained. He scrubbed harder, the bristles of the nail brush tearing at his skin, red marks rising on the knuckles. It did not matter. The sensation persisted. Thorne turned off the tap. Water dripped from his elbows onto the floor, pooling around his shoes. He dried his hands on the coarse towel hanging nearby, the fabric rough against his raw skin, and turned back to the table. The crate waited. The ledger waited. The law required an inventory, required weights and measures, required that the messy reality of a woman's end be reduced to columns of ink and numbers. He picked up his pen. The nib hovered over the paper. Outside, a cart wheel clattered over the cobbles, a sharp sound that faded into the distance. Thorne pressed the nib down. The ink flowed, black and permanent. He wrote the date. He wrote the location. He wrote the weight of the crate as it stood, unopened, and felt the ghost of the shingle grind against his nail beds as he formed the letters. The smell of the wax hung in the air, waiting for him to begin the work. The chisel bit into the wood with a dull crack, splintering the pine along the grain where the nails had rusted shut. Thorne worked the lever back and forth, feeling the resistance of the timber, the stubborn refusal of the box to yield its contents to the dry air of Southwark. A groan escaped the joints. The lid lifted an inch, then two, hinges screaming a high, thin note that set his own teeth on edge before the wood gave way completely. He laid the lid aside. The smell rushed out to meet him, not the sharp sting of the carbolic he had just used, but something heavier, older, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of the throat like spoiled syrup. It sat beneath the brine, distinct from the salt, a perfume of decay that had traveled all the way from Pevensey Bay wrapped in rope and wax. Thorne paused, his hand hovering over the opening, and drew a breath through his mouth to spare his nose the full assault. Damp, he told himself. Just the sea air working into the timber during the transit, mixing with the resin of the pine to create this unnatural fug. To name it anything else would be to admit the crate had breathed during the journey, that the seal broken by the railway men or the coroner's clerk in Sussex had allowed the atmosphere of the murder to leak out and stain the clean floor of his mortuary. He pushed the thought down, buried it under the routine of the ledger, and reached for the packing straw. Right then, he said to the empty room, his voice sounding too loud against the thick walls, "Let us see what you are." He pulled back the layers of rough brown paper, the material stiff, with salt crystals that crumbled under his fingers like dried skin. Beneath the wrapping lay parcels bound in oilcloth, each tied with twine that had bitten deep into the soft bundles during the rough handling the carrier had mentioned. When Thorne picked up the first package, he found it heavy, denser than it looked, and cold enough to make his palms ache through the rubber of his gloves. He placed it on the brass scales, the metal groaning under the weight, and watched the needle settle. 4 pounds 3 ounces. The scratch of the nib was loud in the quiet as he wrote the number down, feeling the grit under his nails grind against the pen barrel. Another parcel followed, then another, each one adding to the column of weights that would eventually sum up a life, reduce a woman to a total mass of flesh and bone that could be filed away in a cabinet marked 1924 homicide. As he worked, the sweet smell grew stronger, rising from the oilcloth, clinging to his sleeves, settling in the creases of his uniform. It was not the smell of the beach. He knew the smell of the beach. He had walked the shingle at Eastbourne as a boy, collecting stones and watching the tide come in. This was different. This was inside, yet he did not stop, for he could not. The law required an inventory, and the inventory required silence. "Steady," he muttered, adjusting a bundle that slipped on the brass pan. "Do not drop it." The last parcel was smaller than the others, wrapped in a scrap of calico rather than oilcloth, tied with a finer string that looked almost domestic amidst the rough packing materials. Thorne lifted it gently, feeling the shape within the fabric, something hard and irregular that shifted when he tilted his hand. He placed it on the scale, 2 pounds 6 ounces. He recorded the weight, capped his pen, and prepared to rewrap the evidence for storage in the cold room. Then he saw it. As he reached into the bottom of the crate to clear away the loose straw, his finger caught on something snagged in the lining of the wood. He pulled his hand back. There, nestled in a groove where the plank had warped, lay a single button. It was small, round, and unburnt, the mother-of-pearl catching the grey light from the window with a soft, iridescent sheen that seemed entirely out of place among the salt-stained pine and the smell of death. Thorne picked it up. It was cool to the touch, smooth on one side, with 4 tiny holes on the reverse where thread had once held it fast to a blouse. He turned it over in his fingers, the nacre flashing white and pink and grey as the angle changed. It did not belong in the weight column. It had no mass that mattered to the ledger, no official category in the list of remains. It was just a button, a trivial thing, yet it felt heavier than the parcels he had just weighed. He looked at the ledger, the neat columns waiting for the next entry, the ink still wet on the page. Then he looked at the button. If he logged it, it became evidence, part of the chain, subject to the same scrutiny as the bones and the flesh. It would be questioned, measured, photographed, discussed by men in wigs who would turn it over and over until its meaning was wrung out of it like water from a rag, or he could keep it, just for now, just to see. He opened the private journal he kept tucked inside his coat, a smaller book with black covers that never left his person. He took out a pencil, softer than the steel nib, and began to sketch. He drew the circle, the 4 holes, the way the light caught the edge. He did not write Exhibit A, he did not write weight, negligible. He just drew the thing itself, capturing the shine of the mother-of-pearl on the page, preserving the one object in the crate that still looked like it had belonged to a living person rather than a crime scene. The sweet smell hung in the air, thick and unmoving, wrapping around him like a shroud. He closed the journal and slipped it back into his pocket, the button resting on top of the blank pages, waiting for a time when the official record would no longer be enough to hold the truth of what had happened on the shingle at Pevensey. The clock on the wall ticked once, a dry, wooden sound, and Thorne realized he had been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs with a hiss, and turned back to the crate to finish the job. There were still labels to affix, seals to break, and the long afternoon stretched out before him, filled with the work of counting the dead. The vertebra rested on the brass pan of the scale, a jagged fragment of white stone that looked too clean for the work it had done. It sat there without weight until Thorne slid the counterpoise along the beam, the metal clicking softly against the notches, seeking equilibrium between the dead flesh and the numbered brass. He held his breath. The needle trembled, dipped, and settled, 3 ounces. A trivial mass for a piece of a spine that had once supported a woman's head, yet the ledger demanded precision down to the fraction. He dipped the nib into the inkwell, the black liquid clinging to the steel point like oil, and brought it down to the page. The column for weight was narrow, printed in rigid blue lines that allowed no room for error or expansion, a grid designed for coal sacks and parcels rather than human remains. He wrote the 3, then the ounce mark. The ink bled slightly into the cheap fiber of the government paper, spreading where the sizing had failed. "Too wide," Thorne said. His voice sounded rough in the small room, unused since morning. He looked at the number. It sprawled across the boundary line, encroaching on the notes column where descriptions of condition and location were meant to sit. The form did not account for the irregularity of bone, only the certainty of mass. He pressed the nib down again, trying to squeeze the fraction into the remaining space, but the paper resisted, the fibers bunching under the pressure. Outside, a lorry backfired on the street, a sharp crack that made his hand jerk, leaving a blot beside the figure. He stared at the stain. It looked like a bruise. The door opened without a knock. Miller stepped in, balancing a tray with 2 chipped mugs and a pot of tea that smelled of stewed leaves and milk. He set the tray on the corner of the desk, careful not to disturb the open ledger or the scale. "Inspector says you've been at it since 6, Miller said, wiping his hands on his apron to leave grey smudges on the fabric. "Thought you might need waking up." Thorne did not look up. He capped the pen. "I am awake." "Doesn't look like it. You're staring at that same line like it's going to bite." Miller poured the tea, the liquid glugging into the ceramic, steam rising in the cool air of the records room. "Besides, the chief constable is coming through later, wants the books tidy before he walks the floor." "The books are tidy." "They are full of blots." Miller pushed a mug towards Thorne's elbow. "Drink it. Cold tea is worse than none." Thorne wrapped his hand around the mug. The heat seeped into his palm, a sharp contrast to the chill that had settled in his bones since opening the crate from Pevensey. He could still smell the sweet decay on his cuffs, distinct from the carbolic soap he had used 3 times that morning. It clung to the wool, a secret he carried into every room he entered. He took a sip. It was bitter, scalding, exactly what was needed to strip the taste of the mortuary from his tongue. "The column is too narrow," Thorne said, gesturing with the pen towards the ledger where the weight does not fit the space provided. Miller leaned over, squinting at the page. He smelled of tobacco and damp wool. Write it smaller. I cannot write it smaller without losing legibility. The law requires clarity. The law requires a signature, Elias. Nobody looks at the ounces. Miller straightened up, adjusting his cap. They look at the total. They look at the bottom line. If the sum matches the crate, nobody counts the bones. Thorne looked at the vertebra, then at the number. The ink was drying, fixing the error onto the page permanently. He could cross it out. He could start a new sheet. But the forms were numbered, registered, and any alteration would require an initial, a reason, a witness. The bureaucracy was a machine that chewed on hesitation. He needed the entry to sit correctly. It needed to align with the blue line that separated weight from notes. He placed his thumb on the margin of the page, just beside the offending figure. The paper was thin, cheap stock meant for temporary use before archiving, yet it felt substantial under his skin. He pressed down. The fiber crunched softly, a dry sound like stepping on autumn leaves. He dragged his thumb across the column, crushing the printed line to make room for the ink to settle, forcing the white space to yield to the black mark. The paper tore slightly at the edge, a tiny jagged rip that mirrored the bone on the scale. There, Thorne said, it fits. Miller watched him. He did not comment on the torn margin or the crushed print. He just picked up the tray. Suit yourself, just have it ready for the chief. Miller. The porter paused at the door. Yes. Did the transport arrive from Lewes? Van came round the front 10 minutes ago, a police escort trailing behind. Miller shifted the tray to one hand. They're keeping him in the holding cell until the afternoon session, since the judge wants to start promptly. Thorne nodded. He did not ask who him was. There was only one prisoner who warranted an escort and a holding cell in the same building as the coroner's records. He looked back at the ledger. The number sat in the crushed margin, aligned perfectly now, the truth of the weight preserved by the destruction of the form. He took another sip of tea and set the mug down hard enough to slosh liquid onto the desk. Get the door, Miller. Miller left, pulling the latch shut behind him. The click of the lock engaged sounded final. Thorne wiped the spilled tea with a rag, rubbing the wood until it was dry, but the damp patch remained on the ledger page, darkening the blue line. He closed the book. The leather cover felt cool under his palms. He stood up and walked to the window, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Outside, the courtyard was grey with exhaust and morning mist. A police van sat idling near the loading bay, the engine ticking as it cooled, smoke puffing from the exhaust pipe in short, rhythmic bursts. The rear doors were closed, painted a dark green that matched the uniforms of the men standing guard beside it. One of the officers lit a cigarette, the flare of the match bright against the dull light, and leaned against the van door as if resting against a garden gate. Thorne pressed his hand against the glass. It was cold. He could not see inside the van, but he knew who sat in the dark behind those panels. He imagined Patrick Mahon sitting on the wooden bench, hands cuffed, straightening his collar despite the chains. The image rose in his mind unbidden, clear and sharp. He turned away from the window and looked back at the desk, at the ledger that held the weight of a woman in crushed columns of paper. The engine outside coughed once, then fell silent, leaving the courtyard waiting for the next movement of the day. The silence inside the room felt heavier than the stone walls, pressing against Thorne's eardrums until the ticking of the clock on the mantel sounded like a hammer strike. He turned from the window, the glass leaving a cold, damp print on his palm that he wiped absently on his trousers. The ledger sat on the desk, closed, a black rectangle of leather that seemed to absorb the weak light filtering through the grime of the high windows. He walked back to it, the floorboards groaning under his weight, a complaint of old timber that echoed the protest of the paper he had just mutilated. He sat down. The chair scraped against the linoleum, a harsh, grating sound that made him flinch. "Stupid," he whispered. The word hung in the air, pointless and true. He had forced the number to fit by breaking the page, a small act of violence against the form that mirrored the greater violence done to the woman whose bones lay on the scale. It was a compromise, a lie told in ink and crushed fiber. He opened the book again. The damp patch from the tea had spread, turning the blue line into a blurred vein of indigo, and the torn edge of the margin curled upward like a dry leaf seeking water. The number for the vertebra sat there, illegible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. hidden in the wreckage of the column. Thorne dipped his pen. The nib was split, a tiny fracture he had ignored for months, and it caught on the rough grain of the cheap paper, depositing a blot of ink that looked like a bruise. He needed to finish the entry. The chief constable would want the book complete before the afternoon session, a tidy record of the morning's grisly inventory to present to the press or the higher-ups who demanded order from chaos. But his hand hovered. The ink gathered at the tip, swelling, ready to drop. He looked at the empty space beside the weight. Notes. The column was wide enough for explanations, for descriptions of condition, for the color of the flesh or the smell of the acid that still clung to the bone fragments. It was meant for context. Instead, it remained blank, a white void next to the crushed numbers. To write anything there felt dangerous. If he wrote fragment of fourth cervical vertebra, jagged edge consistent with sore marks, he was stating a fact. If he wrote human, he was making an accusation. The law required clarity, Miller had said, but the law also required neutrality, and neutrality was a mask that slipped easily when the subject was a pot of boiling acid and a man who smiled while adjusting his tie. Thorne lowered the pen. He did not write. Instead, he reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small, folded square of paper. It was not official stationery. It was scrap, torn from the back of a delivery note, thin and translucent. He unfolded it on the desk, smoothing the creases with a finger that trembled slightly. On the paper was a sketch, done in quick, hard strokes of pencil. A button, mother of pearl, iridescent even in the dull graphite shading. He had drawn it while Miller's back was turned, capturing the way the light caught the rim, the 4 holes drilled with precision, the faint crack running from the edge to the center. It was not in the ledger, it had no weight, it belonged to no column. "Useless," he said aloud. The voice sounded flat, devoid of the anger he felt rising in his chest, a hot, tight knot beneath his ribs. He looked at the sketch, then at the ledger, then at the door where Miller had vanished. The button was real. It had been found in the ash of the fireplace, nestled among the charred remains of wood and coal, untouched by the fire that had consumed everything else around it. Emily Kaye had worn it. Someone had touched it. It was a piece of a life, not a piece of evidence. But here, in this room, it was nothing but a drawing on scrap paper, hidden away because it did not fit the schema of weights and measures. He picked up the ledger again. The pages rustled, dry and brittle. He turned to the back, past the official entries, past the signed attestations of the coroner and the witnesses. There was a flyleaf, blank and unused, meant for nothing more than protecting the binding. He opened it fully. The paper was thick, creamy, untouched by ink. Thorne placed the sketch in the center of the page. He took the pot of paste from the corner of the desk, the brush stiff with dried glue, and dabbed a small amount onto the corners of the scrap. He pressed the paper down. It stuck instantly, the thin material becoming part of the book, hidden inside the official record but separate from it. A secret within a secret. He closed the ledger quickly, as if caught in the act of theft. The engine outside coughed again, a sputtering rattle that broke the stillness. Thorne stood up and moved to the window once more, needing to see the van, needing to confirm that the man inside was still there, still breathing, still adjusting his collar while the world prepared to judge him. The courtyard was unchanged. The smoke from the exhaust had dissipated, leaving a faint, oily haze that hung low over the cobbles. The officer was gone, perhaps inside the van or gone to find a warmer post, but the vehicle remained, a dark green coffin on wheels. Thorne pressed his face closer to the glass. The cold seeped through the pane, chilling his nose and cheeks. He squinted, trying to pierce the gloom of the interior through the small, barred window set high in the side of the van. Nothing, just shadow, but he knew Mahon was there. He could feel the presence of him, a malignant weight in the yard, radiating a calm that felt obscene against the backdrop of the mortuary. A figure moved inside the van. A silhouette shifted against the slat of light. Thorne held his breath, his lungs burning with the effort of stillness. The silhouette rose or seemed to constrained by the roof. An arm lifted. The hand came up to the neck. Even through the grime and the distance, the gesture was unmistakable, fingers straightening the collar, smoothing the fabric. A moment of vanity, of self-regard, performed in the dark while waiting to be taken to the dock. Thorne recoiled. He stepped back from the window, his heel catching on the rug, stumbling slightly before regaining his balance. The gesture haunted him. How could a man who had boiled a woman in acid, who had scattered her remains across the shingle, still care about the line of his shirt? It was a disconnect so profound it felt like a physical blow, a fracture in the logic of the world that Thorne had tried to repair with his ledger and his columns. He looked down at his hands. They were stained with ink, a smudge of black on the side of his right index finger, and beneath the nails, the faint, grey grit of the shingle that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, feeling the roughness, the permanent texture of the crime scene that had migrated to his skin. "The sum matches the crate," Miller had said. But the sum did not include the button. It did not include the collar. It did not include the horror of a man fixing his tie while sitting next to the bones of his victim. The ledger was a lie. A necessary lie, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. It captured the weight of the bone, but missed the weight of the sin. Thorne walked back to the desk and picked up the pen again, feeling the metal cold and heavy in his grip. Opening the ledger to the page with the crushed margin, he saw that the ink was dry now, the tear in the paper set. His gaze settled on the blank notes column before he dipped the pen, watching as the ink flowed, black and viscous. Then he touched the nib to the paper. He wrote nothing. He capped the pen with a sharp click. The sound echoed in the room, final and absolute. He closed the ledger, the worn hide slapping together with a soft thud. He ran his hand over the top, feeling the bump where the scrap paper lay hidden inside, the secret sketch of the button that proved a woman had existed, had worn clothes, had lived. A knock came at the door, 3 sharp raps, authoritative and impatient. "Mr. Thorne," the voice was muffled, distorted by the wood. "Chief Constable is here, he wants the book." Thorne stared at the ledger. His hand rested on the cover, shielding the hidden page, shielding the truth he had buried inside the official record. He took a breath, the air tasting of dust and old tea, and the faint, sweet scent of decay that refused to leave his clothes. "Coming," he said. His voice sounded steady, betraying nothing. He picked up the ledger. It felt heavier than before, as if the hidden paper had added weight to the whole, dragging down his arm. He walked to the door, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the creaking floor. He reached for the handle, his fingers closing around the cold brass. He turned the latch. The train carriage smelled of wet wool and coal smoke, a thick, clinging fug that settled in the throat and tasted of the journey itself. Thorne shifted on the wooden bench, the varnish worn smooth by decades of trousers, and pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the Sussex countryside blurred into a smear of grey hedgerows and sodden fields, the rain lashing the pane in rhythmic, blurring strokes that obscured the passing telegraph poles. He adjusted the collar of his coat, feeling the dampness seep through the fabric despite the shelter, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do where he was going. Lewes. The name sat heavy in his mind, a destination marked not on a map, but in the ledger waiting on the desk of the court clerk, a book of pages yet unturned, of weights yet unrecorded. "Tickets, please." The conductor's voice cut through the murmur of the other passengers, sharp and official. Thorne fumbled in his pocket, his fingers brushing the rough edge of the notebook he carried, the one bound in black leather that held his private scrawls alongside the government-issued forms. He produced the ticket, a small slip of cardboard already softening at the corners from the humidity of his grip. The conductor punched it, the metal jaws snapping with a sound like a bone breaking, and moved on without a glance, already calling for the next passenger's fare. Thorne tucked the stub away, watching the rain streak the glass, distorting the world outside into something fluid and unreal. The train slowed, the wheels grinding against the rails with a shriek that set teeth on edge, the brakes engaging with a hydraulic hiss that spoke of heavy loads and sudden stops. Lewes Station emerged from the grey mist, a sprawl of brick and iron ghosted by the weather, the platform crowded with figures huddled under umbrellas or collars turned up against the drizzle. Thorne stood as the carriage jolted to a halt, the momentum throwing him slightly forward before he caught the strap above the seat. He stepped down onto the platform, his boots striking the wet stone with a solid click, the air outside even thicker with the scent of rain and the underlying, briny tang of the coast that lay just beyond the town. He joined the flow of people moving towards the exit, a current of somber coats and lowered eyes, all drawn by the same grim magnetism towards the assizes. The crowd parted around him, indifferent, each person lost in their own anticipation or dread, their whispers rising and falling like the tide. "They say he looked her in the eye," a woman muttered to her companion, her voice low but carrying clearly in the damp air. "They say he smiled." Thorne kept his gaze forward, focusing on the back of a man's hat, a bowler slick with rain, using it as an anchor to navigate the press of bodies without having to meet anyone's glance. The walk to the court was short, but felt elongated by the weight of the atmosphere, the streets narrow and cobbled, reflecting the sky in dark, oily pools that gathered in the depressions of the stone. Thorne kept his hand on the satchel at his side, feeling the hard angle of the ledger within, a constant reminder of the duty that waited. He passed a shop window where a mannequin stood dressed in the latest fashion, a bright splash of color in the monochrome street, and for a second he thought of the button, the mother-of-pearl disc he had sketched in the privacy of his room, the only thing that had survived the fire with its sheen intact. He pushed the thought away, forcing his mind to the task ahead, to the columns and the rows, to the sterile language of the law that would soon attempt to contain the uncontainable. Inside the courtroom, the air was stagnant, heated by the press of too many bodies in a space designed for fewer, the smell of old wood and dust mingling with the pungent odor of wet clothing drying on warm skin. Thorne showed his credentials to the usher, a man with a face like crumpled parchment who nodded silently and pointed towards the designated gallery for clerks, a raised box tucked to the side of the main floor where the light was poor and the view partially obstructed by a heavy oak pillar. He climbed the steps, his movements careful, and took a seat on the hard bench, placing the satchel on his knees. Around him, the room buzzed with a low, incessant hum, the sound of hundreds of people waiting for the drama to begin, their expectations hanging palpable in the heat. He opened his notebook, the pen ready in his hand, but he did not write. Instead, he watched the floor below, where the lawyers arranged their papers with meticulous care, stacking briefs into neat piles that suggested order could be imposed on chaos simply by aligning the edges. The dock stood empty for now, a wooden cage that looked deceptively ordinary, nothing more than a partition of varnished timber that separated the accused from the rest of the world. Thorne's eyes drifted to the judge's bench, high and imposing, where Mr. Justice Avery would soon take his seat, a figure of authority whose voice would carry the weight of the crown. A movement in the front row caught his attention. A woman, dressed in black, her head bowed, was shaking. At first, it was subtle, a tremor in the shoulders that might have been mistaken for a chill, but then a sound escaped her, a low, keening wail that cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Heads turned, whispers ceased. The woman lifted a handkerchief to her face, her body convulsing with the force of her grief, the sound raw and unpolished, a stark violation of the courtroom's decorum. Avery entered. The bailiff's cry of "all rise" snapped the room to attention, chairs scraping against the floor in a discordant chorus as everyone surged to their feet. The judge ascended the steps to the bench, his robes settling around him with a rustle of silk, his face a mask of impassive severity. He waited for the silence to return, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on the weeping woman. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable, the only sound the woman's stifled sobbing, which she tried desperately to suppress, her shoulders heaving against the constraint of her own ribs. "Madam," Avery said, his voice clear and devoid of warmth, carrying easily to the furthest corner of the gallery. "This is a court of law, not a theater of emotions. Tears have no jurisdiction here. They do not alter the facts, nor do they weigh the evidence. Compose yourself, or you will be removed." The woman flinched as if struck, her hand freezing against her mouth. She nodded, a jerky, frantic motion, and swallowed the sound, her eyes wide and wet with the effort of containment. Thorne felt a tightness in his own chest, a sympathetic constriction that made it hard to draw a full breath. He looked down at his notebook, at the blank page waiting for the timeline, and felt the absurdity of the moment, the way the law demanded the excision of humanity in the very process of judging human acts. He dipped his pen, the ink flowing black and final, and wrote the time, 10:00 a.m. The nib scratched against the paper, a harsh sound in the renewed quiet. The prosecution rose to begin the opening statement, the lawyer's voice droning through the established facts, the dates, the locations, the sequence of events that led from Pevensey Bay to this room. Thorne listened, his hand moving automatically to record the key points, but his attention was drawn upward, to the great clock mounted on the wall above the judge's head. It was a massive thing, brass and mahogany, its face gleaming in the gaslight, the second hand sweeping with a steady, hypnotic tick-tock that seemed to measure out the life of the trial itself. The minute hand approached the hour. The room held its breath, the tension ratcheting up with each passing second. The prosecutor paused for effect, a rhetorical gesture timed to the impending chime. The clock struck the first note, a deep, resonant boom that vibrated in the floorboards. 1, 2, 3, and then on the fourth strike, the mechanism faltered. The hammer lifted but did not fall. The silence that rushed in to fill the gap was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. The prosecutor stood with his mouth open, the next word trapped in his throat. Avery froze, his pen hovering over the bench. The spectators stared, unblinking, caught in the suspended animation of the broken time. Thorne felt his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that clashed with the stillness. He watched the clock, willing it to move, to complete the sequence, to restore the order of things. Seconds stretched into an eternity, the silence becoming a physical presence, heavy and suffocating. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, the mechanism engaged. The hammer fell. 4, 5, 6. The remaining strikes crashed out in rapid succession, making up for lost time, the sound harsh and discordant after the pause. The spell broke. The prosecutor exhaled, an audible rush of air, and continued his sentence, his voice slightly shaken, the flow disrupted. Thorne looked down at his page at the time he had written, 10:00 a.m., but the clock had lied, or perhaps it had told a deeper truth, one that the ledger could not capture. He glanced towards the dock. Patrick Mahon had entered. He stood tall, his posture impeccable, his suit pressed and dark, showing no sign of the journey or the accusation that hung over him. He kept his chin high, ignoring both the judge and the weeping woman who now sat rigid and dry-eyed in the front row. Instead, his gaze swept the gallery, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence, inspecting the faces of the spectators as if evaluating an audience for a performance. His eyes met Thorne's for a fleeting second, bright and unsettlingly calm, before moving on. There was no fear in that look, no plea for mercy. There was only a kind of vain expectation, a desire to be seen, to be understood, to have the narrative appreciated. Thorne tightened his grip on the pen, the wood digging into his palm, and waited for the first question, the first lie, the first attempt to fit a life into a column. The dock creaked. Mahon shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the iron grating, a small domestic sound that seemed obscenely loud in the hushed room. He did not fidget. He did not glance at the heavy chain that tethered him to the floor, nor did he acknowledge the two warders who flanked him like somber bookends. Instead, he smoothed the lapel of his jacket, a gesture of such casual vanity that Thorne's pen hovered, ink pooling at the nib, before dripping a single, dark tear onto the margin. The man was arranging himself for display. Patrick Mahon, the clerk of arraigns, intoned, his voice dry as dust, reciting the charge with the rhythmic monotony of a man who had swallowed too many similar words over too many years. That you, on the 10th day of October, 1924, at Pevensey Bay, in the county of Sussex, did feloniously, wilfully, and of your malice aforethought, kill and murder Emily Kaye. The words hung there, heavy and final, stripping the air of oxygen. Mahon nodded, a single sharp dip of the chin. Not guilty, he said. His voice was clear, baritone, lacking any tremor of the man who had boiled flesh in a pot on a kitchen range. It was the voice of a gentleman correcting a waiter on the vintage of a wine, confident that the error was merely a misunderstanding of taste. Thorne watched the defendant's hands. They rested on the rail of the dock, pale and well-manicured, the nails trimmed to a perfect crescent. These were not the hands of a butcher, nor of a madman. They were the hands of a man who believed himself to be the protagonist of a story in which he could talk his way out of any plot hole. Mahon turned his head slightly, sweeping his gaze across the public gallery again, his eyes lingering on the women in the front rows, seeking validation, perhaps even admiration, for the sheer audacity of his denial. He was not looking for justice. He was looking for an audience. Mr. Justice Avery leaned forward, the silk of his robes whispering against the wood of the bench. "The prosecution will open," he commanded, his gaze fixed on the lawyer standing below, a man named Curtis-Bennett who wore his certainty like a second skin. Curtis-Bennett rose, adjusting his wig with a practiced flick of the wrist. He began to speak, weaving a tapestry of horror from the sterile threads of evidence. He spoke of the train journey from London Bridge, of the basket that had travelled with the couple, of the arrival at Eastbourne and the subsequent move to the bungalow at Pevensey Bay. His voice was smooth, polished, turning the jagged edges of dismemberment into a narrative of travel and leisure. He mentioned the acid. He mentioned the fire. He mentioned the shingle. Thorne's hand moved across the page, capturing the keywords, the dates, the locations. Pevensey, acid, fireplace, shingle. The words looked innocent enough in blue-black ink, neat and orderly, but they carried the weight of a woman reduced to fragments. He thought of the crate in the mortuary, the sealing wax that smelled of sweet decay, the way the bone fragments had refused to fit into the columns of his ledger without crushing the paper. Here in this theatre, the crushing was verbal. The law was taking the messy, bloody reality of a life extinguished and forcing it into a shape that could be judged, measured, and filed. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Curtis-Bennett described the discovery of the remains. The weeping woman in the front row, the one Avery had silenced, sat rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the bench before her. She did not cry out. She did not collapse. She simply absorbed the words, her face a mask of stunned agony, her breath coming in short, shallow hitches that Thorne could hear from 20 feet away. It was a terrible thing, to sit and listen to the inventory of your sister's destruction, to hear the parts of her body listed like items on a grocer's bill. Mahon listened too. He tilted his head, as if considering the prosecution's account with mild academic interest. When Curtis-Bennett mentioned the head, found wrapped in paper and hidden in the grass, Mahon's lips twitched. Not a smile exactly, more a suppression of one, a private joke shared with himself. He knew something they did not. Or perhaps he simply believed that if he acted the part of the innocent man long enough, the role would solidify into truth. Thorne felt a surge of nausea, a physical revulsion that rose from his gut and tightened his throat. He put down his pen. The wood of the desk felt cold under his palm, solid and unyielding. He looked at the clock again. The hands had moved past the hour, the momentary stutter forgotten by everyone except him. The mechanism ticked on, relentless and indifferent, measuring out the seconds of a trial that would end in a hanging, regardless of the truth. The law would have its conclusion. The ledger would be filled, the columns would balance. But the woman was still gone. Curtis-Bennett paused, reaching for a glass of water on the table before him. The silence returned, thicker this time, laden with the unspoken horrors that hung in the air between the words. Mahon took the opportunity to straighten his tie, pulling the knot tight against his collar, his eyes meeting Thorne's once more. There was a challenge in that look, a daring. "Try to catch me," it said. "Try to make me real." Thorne picked up his pen again. The nib touched the paper, hovering over the next line of the transcript. He had to write it down. He had to record the lie as faithfully as the truth, for that was his duty, to be the witness, to be the scribe of the erasure. He pressed the nib to the page, the ink flowing out, black and permanent, capturing the moment where a man tried to convince the world that he had not turned a woman into smoke and bone. The prosecutor resumed his speech, his voice rising in volume, building towards the climax of his opening. "And so, my lord, we shall show that the accused, in a calculated attempt to conceal his crime, sought to dissolve the very identity of the deceased, to render her nothing more than a stain on the carpet and a smell in the air." Mahon shook his head, a slow, sorrowful motion, as if pitying the prosecutor's lack of imagination. He looked out at the crowd, his expression one of wounded innocence. He was ready for his turn. He was ready to tell his story, the one where he was the victim of circumstance, the misunderstood lover, the man trapped by a tragic accident. Thorne watched him, feeling the distance between the man in the dock and the horror he had committed. It was a chasm that no amount of words could bridge. The trial had begun, the machine was in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The clock ticked, the pen scratched, the woman remained silent. And Mahon waited for his cue. The recess bell clanged, a brass-jarred note that shattered the courtroom's stifling air. Silence broke into shuffling feet and the low murmur of coats rubbing against wood. Thorne did not move. He kept his seat in the clerk's row, his spine pressed against the hard oak backrest, watching the defendant. Patrick Mahon leaned towards his counsel, Sir Henry Curtis-Bennett, with the easy posture of a man discussing weekend plans rather than the disposal of a lover's corpse. The barrister nodded, pen poised over a yellow pad, listening intently as Mahon spoke. Thorne could not hear the words from this distance, but he read the shape of them on Mahon's lips. Tidy, order, arrangement. Mahon gestured with a manicured hand, outlining a space in the air. He was describing the flat at 5 Cranley Gardens. Thorne knew the photographs pinned to the evidence board behind the judge's bench. The charred grate, the blackened wallpaper peeling like burnt skin, the floorboards stained with a darkness no scrubbing brush could lift. Yet Mahon smiled. It was a pleasant expression, devoid of malice, almost domestic. He spoke of his preference for tidiness, of how a man's home reflected his character, of the importance of keeping things in their proper place. A laugh escaped him, soft and polite. Curtis-Bennett smiled back, a professional widening of the mouth that did not reach his eyes. Thorne's stomach turned. The scent of carbolic soap, used to mop the floors before the session, mingled with the unwashed wool of the gallery crowd, creating a cloying fog that stuck to the back of the throat. He looked down at his own hands. They were stained with ink, a permanent blue-black shadow under the nails that no amount of scrubbing removed. He had spent the morning transcribing the list of items purchased by the accused: a trunk, a hammer, a chisel, stones from the beach, acid. A shopping list for Erasure, banality wrapped in brown paper. He picked up his pen. The nib felt cold, a sliver of steel against his calloused finger. He had to record this. Not the smile, not the lie, but the fact of the statement. The defendant remarks upon his domestic habits. The words looked absurd on the page, sterile and inadequate. How does one inventory a soul's rot? How does one weigh the distance between a man's words and the charred bone in a pot? Thorne glanced at the evidence table where photographs lay scattered, glossy and grim. One showed the fireplace in detail, the iron grate warped from heat, and the bricks behind it blackened by a fire that had roared hot enough to consume flesh, but not quite enough to destroy evidence. Ash had settled in the crevices, grey and fine. In the corner of the print, a fragment of something unidentifiable rested on the hearth. Was it a button, a piece of tooth? The caption read simply, Exhibit 14. Contents of grate. Mahon was still talking. He leaned back now, crossing one leg over the other, the crease in his trousers sharp enough to cut. He adjusted his cufflink, a small gold disc that caught the light from the high windows. The gesture was vain, habitual, a man ensuring his armor was intact before battle. He looked around the courtroom, nodding to an acquaintance in the press box, acknowledging the world as if he were a host at a garden party. There was no tension in his shoulders, no flicker of fear in his eyes. He believed his own performance, or perhaps he believed that the performance was all that mattered. If he acted the part of the respectable gentleman often enough, the jury would forget the smell of burning that had drifted across the Crumbles. Thorne pressed the nib to the paper. Ink flowed, dark and viscous. He wrote the time, he wrote the speaker, he wrote the words tidiness and order. Each letter felt like a betrayal. By recording Mahon's lie with such neat precision, he was giving it weight, granting it the same authority as the truth. The ledger did not distinguish between an honest man's statement and a murderer's fabrication. It only demanded accuracy. It required the scribe to be a mirror, reflecting whatever stood before it, no matter how grotesque. A woman in the gallery coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed in the sudden lull of conversation. Mahon's head snapped towards the noise, his smile vanishing for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Thorne. For a moment, the mask slipped. The pupils were pinpricks, the skin around the mouth tight. Then he blinked, and the respectable tenant of Cranley Gardens returned, sipping water from a glass provided by the usher. Thorne looked away. He focused on the photograph again. The charred wood seemed to pulse under his gaze, a visual echo of the heat that had consumed Emily Kaye. He thought of the crate in the morgue, the sealing wax with its sweet, sickly odor of decay that he had noted days ago. He had dismissed it as dampness then, a trick of the coastal air. Now he knew better. The smell had been waiting. It had been seeping through the wood, through the paper, through the very walls of the court, announcing the truth that Mahon tried to bury under layers of polite conversation. The usher banged his staff on the floor. Silence, all rise. The judge entered, robes swishing, face impassive. The court resumed its seat. Thorne dipped his pen again, ready for the next volley of questions, the next layer of deception. But before the prosecutor could speak, Mr. Justice Avery leaned forward, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Mr. Curtis-Bennett," Avery said, his tone dry, devoid of inflection. "Before we proceed with the witness testimony regarding the trunk, the Crown has indicated a desire to introduce a further exhibit, one that requires specific preparation." Curtis-Bennett stood, smoothing his gown. "Indeed, my lord, the prosecution wishes to present the vessel itself." A ripple went through the room, not a murmur this time, but a physical recoil that made shoulders hunch and heads turn away. Thorne felt the air grow heavier, charged with a sudden, primal dread. "The acid pot," Curtis-Bennett announced, his voice steady despite the tension tightening the room, "containing the remains of the deceased." Mahon did not flinch. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on the door where the exhibit would enter. He looked bored. He looked ready. Thorne's hand hovered over the page. The ink pooled at the tip of the nib, a dark drop waiting to fall. He knew what came next. He knew the smell that would fill the room, the sight of the boiled fragments, the final destruction of any remaining illusion that this was merely a legal dispute. The architecture of lies was about to collapse under the weight of the thing itself. The door at the back of the courtroom opened, and two policemen entered carrying a box between them. They moved slowly, carefully, as if handling a live bomb. The gallery held its breath. While Mahon watched them approach, his expression remained unchanged, his tie still perfectly straight. Thorne pressed the pen down. The nib scratched against the paper, recording the moment the past walked into the present. Box settled on the table with a dull thud that traveled up through the floorboards and into the soles of Thorne's shoes. Wood against wood. No ceremony, just the heavy, awkward weight of a thing that should never have been moved. The policemen stepped back, wiping their hands on their trousers as if they had touched something greasy, something that clung. One of them, a young constable with a face the color of wet plaster, retreated to the wall and stared fixedly at the skirting board. He would not look at the box. He would not look at Mahon. He looked at nothing. Curtis-Bennett approached the table. He did not rush. He adjusted his spectacles, the gold chain glinting briefly under the gas lamps, and placed a hand on the lid. His fingers hovered there, trembling just enough to be visible to those in the front row. A pause, a breath held by 300 people. Then he lifted the lid. The smell hit them before the sight. It was not the sharp, chemical bite of sulfuric acid that Thorne had expected, nor the clean, sterile scent of the mortuary. It was sweet, cloying, a thick, cloying odor of boiled meat and wet ash that rolled out of the box like fog, filling the space between the benches, climbing the walls, settling in the back of the throat. It tasted of copper. It tasted of old pennies left in the rain. Thorne's stomach turned, a slow, sickening roll that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the sudden, violent recognition of flesh that had been cooked. Beside him, a juror gagged. The sound was wet, ugly, and immediately suppressed by a hand clamped over a mouth. Avery did not react. He sat motionless, his face a mask of carved stone, though his nostrils flared once, twice, as he forced himself to breathe the air without flinching. He had spoken of tears having no place here. He clearly believed vomit had no jurisdiction either. Inside the box, the pot sat nested in straw. It was an ordinary cooking vessel, blackened on the outside, the enamel chipped to reveal the grey iron beneath. Inside, the liquid was dark, viscous, a sludge that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Floating on the surface were fragments, white shards that might have been bone, dark clumps that defied identification, a shape that looked unsettlingly like a curl of hair, matted and stiff. "Exhibit 19, Curtis-Bennett said. His voice sounded thin, stretched tight over the horror in the room. The vessel in which the accused attempted to dissolve the body of Emily Kaye. Mahon leaned forward. He did not recoil. He did not cover his nose. He peered into the pot with the detached curiosity of a man inspecting a stew that had simmered too long. He tilted his head, examining the contents, then nodded slowly, as if confirming a detail of household management. Tidy enough, I suppose, he murmured. Words were quiet, meant perhaps only for his counsel, but in the silence of the court they carried. They cut through the sensory assault with a precision that made Thorne's skin crawl. Tidy, the word hung there, absurd and monstrous. Mahon spoke of dismemberment and dissolution as one might speak of sweeping the hearth or polishing the silver. He had built a world inside his head where this was normal, where boiling a woman in acid was merely a chore, a necessary step in maintaining the order of his flat. Thorne's hand moved, and he could not stop it as the pen scratched across the page, recording the exhibit number, the description, the time, 11:42 a.m. Pot introduced, contents visible. The ink flowed, dark and relentless, while he wrote the word remains, then acid, then Mahon's comment. Each word was a nail in a coffin he was building for his own sanity. He was transcribing the unspeakable into the bureaucratic, turning the sweet, rotting smell of death into a line item in a government ledger. He looked at the photograph on the table again, the charred fireplace, the blackened bricks. Now, with the pot open before him, the photograph made sense. The fire had been the first attempt. When the flames had failed to consume her completely, when the heat had warped the iron but left the bones intact, Mahon had moved to the pot. He had sought a second method, a cleaner method. He had pursued tidiness with the relentless focus of a fanatic. A woman in the gallery began to weep, soft, hiccuping sobs that she tried to smother with a handkerchief. Avery's head snapped towards the sound, his eyes narrowed. "Madam," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "if you cannot compose yourself, you will be removed. This is a court of law, not a theatre." The weeping stopped instantly, cut off as if by a knife, and the woman shrank into her coat while her shoulders shook silently. As the terror in the room shifted, it became clear this was no longer just about the dead woman in the pot, but about the living people forbidden to react to her. They had to sit still and breathe the air, forced to watch Mahon inspect his handiwork without making a sound. Thorne felt the grit under his nails again. He had washed his hands 3 times that morning with carbolic soap, scrubbing until the skin was raw, but the sensation remained. It was not dirt. It was the memory of the crate from Pevensey, the sealing wax, the sweet odor he had dismissed as dampness. It had been this. It had been the smell of the pot, seeping through the wood, traveling hundreds of miles to reach him in the mortuary before the trial even began. The evidence had been speaking to him all along, and he had refused to listen. He had filed it away as damp. He had categorized it. He had made it safe. Just as he was doing now. Curtis-Bennett picked up a pair of tongs from the table. Metal clicked against metal. He reached into the pot. The tongs disappeared into the sludge. He stirred the contents gently, lifting a fragment clear of the liquid. It dripped. A dark drop fell back into the pot with a soft plip. "This fragment," Curtis-Bennett said, holding it up for the jury to see, "was recovered from the bottom of the vessel. It has been identified by Dr. Spilsbury as part of a human vertebra." The bone was small, white against the dark background of the court. It looked innocent, like a piece of driftwood washed up on the shingle, but Thorne knew what it was. He knew the weight of it. He had seen the jagged edges of other vertebrae forced into the columns of his logbook, crushing the paper margin to make the numbers align. He saw that crushed paper now. He saw the way the law tried to force the messy reality of murder into neat boxes, sacrificing truth for form, just as he had crushed the paper. Mahon watched the bones swing from the tongs. He smiled, a small, private smile. He adjusted his tie again, pulling the knot tight, ensuring the fabric lay flat against his collar. The gesture was automatic, a tick of vanity amidst the display of boiled bones. He was still the host. He was still the master of the house. Even here, with the smell of his crime choking the room, he maintained the facade. He believed that if he looked the part, he was the part. Thorne's pen stopped. The ink pooled at the nib, a dark drop waiting to fall, mirroring the drop that had fallen from the tongs seconds before. He looked at Mahon. He looked at the bone. He looked at the ledger. The disconnect was absolute, for Mahon lived in a world of surfaces, of ties and tidiness and polite conversation, while the court lived in a world of facts and evidence and procedure. Yet Emily Kaye lived in neither. She was in the pot, the smell, and the silence that the judge enforced. She was the thing that could not be recorded, only measured. "Place it in the evidence tray," Avery ordered. The tongs clattered. The bone landed on the velvet with a soft tap. Mahon leaned back, satisfied. The performance continued. But Thorne knew something had shifted, for the smell was in his clothes now, in his hair, and it would follow him home to Southwark. It would cling to the pages of the ledger, seeping into the fibres of the paper, waiting for the next clerk to open the book and wonder why the air in the room suddenly tasted of copper and old pennies. The architecture of lies was crumbling, yet the rubble was toxic. Attempt 1. He dipped the pen, because he had to write it down, he had to record the vertebra, he had to note the time. It was his duty to do his duty. Critique 1. It was his duty to do his duty changes the phrasing too much. The prompt says, keep every event, detail, action. The nib touched the paper. The scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room, louder than the weeping, louder than the breathing, louder than the truth. And outside, the wind began to pick up off the channel, carrying the salt air against the windows, trying to scrub the room clean, failing as it always failed. The lid lifted. A gasp rippled through the gallery, not uniform but jagged, a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen from the room before the scent even arrived. It hit Thorne first, a physical weight pressing against the sinuses, distinct from the stale tobacco and damp wool of the courtroom. Sweet, cloying. The specific, sickly perfume of decay that had haunted the sealing wax of the crate in Pevensey, dismissed then as mere dampness, as a trick of the coastal air. Now it flooded the space, overwhelming the carbolic soap the ushers had scrubbed the floor with that morning. It was the smell of the pot, unsealed, breathing its contents into the justice system. Steady, the usher muttered, stepping back, his hand flying to his nose before he caught himself and dropped it, shame flushing his neck. Thorne did not move. He sat frozen, the pen hovering over the ledger, the ink drying on the nib. He had washed his hands 3 times before leaving Southwark, scrubbing until the skin roared and pinked, yet the grit of shingle remained under his nails. It was not dirt, it was memory. The crate had never been sealed against the atmosphere of the crime. The wax had been porous, allowing the essence of Emily Kaye to seep into the wood, to travel hundreds of miles and wait for this exact moment of revelation. The evidence had been speaking to him since Chapter 1, whispering through the pores of the packing case, and he had filed it under damp. He had categorized the horror. He had made it safe. Curtis-Bennett waved a hand in front of his face, a futile gesture against the invisible fog. Your lordship, the odor is considerable. Proceed, Mr. Curtis-Bennett, Avery said, his voice flat, cutting through the sensory assault. The jury must see. The barrister gripped the tongs again, his knuckles white. He reached into the sludge, the metal jaws disappearing into the murky fluid. He stirred, gentle, respectful, as if handling holy relics rather than the boiled remnants of a woman. When he lifted the object, a dark drop clung to it, trembling, before falling back into the pot with a soft plip that echoed in the sudden quiet. This, Curtis-Bennett announced, his voice tight, is a fragment of bone, recovered from the vessel, identified by Dr. Spilsbury as a portion of the cervical vertebra. He held it up, white against the dark wood of the bench, small and innocuous like a piece of driftwood bleached by the sun on the Crumbles. Yet Thorne saw the jagged edge where it had been snapped, the violence required to separate it from the spine. He remembered the logbook in his office, the pre-printed weight column that had forced him to crush the paper margin to make the numbers fit. He had squeezed the reality of a human being into a box designed for coal or grain. Just as the trial was the same, a massive, chaotic brutality being crushed into the neat, preordained columns of the law, truth sacrificed for form. Mahon watched the bones swing. He held his ground, eyes locked on the arc of the motion. He smiled, a small, private curving of the lips that did not reach his eyes. His hand moved to his tie, adjusting the knot, pulling it tight against his collar. The fabric lay flat, perfect, a gesture of vanity amidst the display of boiled remains. He was still the host, still the master of the house, maintaining the facade that tidiness was a moral virtue, that a clean shirt could absolve a bloody act. He believed the performance. He believed that if he looked the part of the gentleman, the jury would see a gentleman, not a butcher. Thorne's pen remained still. The ink pooled at the tip, a dark bead waiting to drop, mirroring the fluid on the bone. His eyes flicked from Mahon's polished cuffs to the greasy vertebra, then to the blank line in his ledger where the weight should be recorded. The disconnect was absolute. Mahon inhabited a world of surfaces, of knots and collars and polite conversation. The court inhabited a world of facts and procedure, of admissible evidence and judicial instruction. Emily Kaye inhabited neither. She was in the pot. She bare yeru the smell. She was the silence Avery enforced. She was the thing that could not truly be recorded, only measured, weighed, and filed. Place it in the evidence tray, Avery ordered. The tongs clattered against the glass dish. The bone landed on the velvet with a dull tap. Mahon leaned back, satisfied, the adjustment of his tie complete. The performance continued, the machinery of the law grinding forward despite the stench. "Miss Florence Kaye," the clerk called out, his voice cracking slightly on the name. The side door opened. A woman entered, small, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the light from the high windows. She walked with a stiffness, as if her joints ached, her eyes fixed on the floor until she reached the witness box. She did not look at Mahon. She did not look at the pot. She looked at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "Please approach the table," Curtis-Bennett said, softer now. He picked up a small paper packet from the pile of exhibits. He unfolded the corners, revealing a single object resting on the white lining. Thorne leaned forward, his chair creaking. He knew what was there. In Chapter 2, Alone in the Mortuary, he had sketched it in his private ledger, omitting it from the official wait list. A button, mother of pearl, unburnt, surviving the fire and the acid and the boiling water. He had drawn its sheen, the way the light caught the iridescent surface, a tiny moon in the darkness of his notebook. "Do you recognize this item, Miss Kaye?" Florence lifted her head. Her eyes found the button. She did not reach out. She simply stared, her breath hitching, a small broken sound that escaped before she could clamp her lips shut. The court rules demanded no emotion. Tears had no jurisdiction here, but the body betrays the law. Her shoulders shook, a silent tremor that ran through her frame. "Yes," she whispered. The word was barely audible, lost in the heavy air. "Could you speak louder, please, for the record?" "It was Emily's," she said, her voice gaining strength, trembling with a furious grief. "On her favorite blouse, the one with the blue stripes. She bought it in Eastbourne last summer. She said the color matched the sea." A murmur ran through the gallery, quickly suppressed by Avery's glare, and Thorne felt the impact of those words like a physical blow. The color matched the sea. It was not Exhibit 4B, nor 0.5 ounces of calcified material, but a blouse, a choice, a preference, a woman who liked the color of the sea. The ledger in front of him suddenly looked obscene, a collection of lies dressed as facts. He had recorded the weight of the button, the diameter, the material composition. He had not recorded that it matched the sea. Mahon's smile vanished. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in irritation, a flicker of annoyance that his tidy narrative had been punctured by something so domestic, so undeniably human. He straightened his tie again, a frantic, jerky motion, but the damage was done. The button was not just evidence, it was a ghost stepping out of the pot to stand beside his sister. "Thank you, Miss Kaye," Curtis-Bennett said gently. "You may step down." Florence did not move immediately. She looked at the button one last time, as if committing it to memory, before turning and walking back to the door. She did not cry. She walked with her head high, carrying the weight of the identification alone. Avery cleared his throat. The sound was harsh in the quiet room. He looked at the clock on the wall, then at the jury, several of whom were pale, hands pressed to their mouths. The scent of the pot had not dissipated. It had settled, coating the tongue, the throat, the lungs. "The court will adjourn," Avery declared, his voice lacking its usual iron certainty, and though he announced they would resume at 10 tomorrow, he added that until then, the windows are to be opened. The bailiffs moved to the sashes, heaving the heavy frames up. A gust of wind from the channel rushed in, cold and salty, clashing with the sweet rot inside. It was not enough. The smell was in the woodwork now. It was in the velvet of the jury box. It was in Thorne's clothes, woven into the fibers of his suit, destined to follow him home to Southwark, to cling to the pages of the ledger, to seep into the very air of his rooms. Thorne closed his book. The embossed hide felt cool under his palms, a stark contrast to the heat rising in his face. He stood up, his legs stiff, and walked towards the exit, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He passed Mahon, who was already reconstructing his demeanor, smoothing his lapels, preparing to be led back to the cells. The prisoner did not look at him. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the salt air against the stone facade of the assizes, trying to scrub the building clean. It failed. The scent of truth was too deep. It had taken root. And Thorne knew, as he stepped onto the pavement and pulled his coat tight against the chill, that he would carry it with him long after the trial ended, long after the execution, long after the ledger was locked away in the archives. It was the smell of a woman who had been erased, fighting her way back into the world, one button, one bone, one breath at a time. He walked towards the station, the rhythm of his boots on the pavement matching the ticking of the clock that had stuck on the hour, marking the precise second where the possibility of innocence had died, leaving only the heavy, suffocating certainty of what had been done. The bailiffs heaved the sashes higher, wood groaning against stone, but the draught from the channel did not scour the room clean. It only stirred the sweetness, mixing salt with rot until the air tasted of a low tide that had gone out too far and left something behind. Thorne stood by his table, fingers gripping the edge of the ledger until the knuckles whitened, the embossed calf hide cool against his palms while his face burned. He needed to leave. Now. Before the smell settled into his skin permanently, before it became part of him, the way the shingle grit had refused to wash from under his nails in Chapter 1. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the side, low and urgent. Curtis-Bennett was packing his papers, shoving documents into a battered case with uncharacteristic haste, his usual flourish replaced by a jerky efficiency, his gaze welded to the scattered sheets. "So, ensure the exhibit log is sealed before you depart. Avery wants no discrepancies overnight, not after this." The barrister gestured vaguely at the pot, now covered again, though the lid seemed insufficient, a thin disk of metal against the heavy, cloying vapor rising from within. "And burn your notes if you have any, private ones, best not to carry ghosts home." Thorne nodded, though the instruction sparked a flare of defiance in his chest. Burn the sketch, the button drawn in pencil, the iridescent sheen captured on paper when the official record demanded only weight and circumference. No, he would not burn it. He would hide it, tuck it deep into the binding where the light could not reach, where the smell might not penetrate. "I will secure the ledger, sir, nothing more." Curtis-Bennett paused, hand hovering over the latch of his case. He looked at Thorne then, really looked at him, seeing perhaps the pallor of his skin or the way his shoulders hunched against the invisible weight. "Suit yourself, just don't let anyone see it. The judge is unsettled." Unsettled, a polite word for a man who had just watched a sister identify her dead sibling by a piece of clothing survived by acid and fire. Avery sat high in his chair, staring at the wall behind the jury box, his hands clasped so tightly the tendons stood out like white cords. He was not wiping his hands yet, that would come later, in the privacy of his chambers, the trembling gesture planted for Chapter 8, but the rigidity of his posture spoke volumes. The law demanded order. The evidence provided chaos. Thorne turned back to his desk. The ink on the latest entry was still wet, a dark pool reflecting the grey light from the window. Exhibit 4B1 button, mother of pearl, identified by Florence Kaye. He dipped his pen, the nib scratching against the paper, a harsh sound in the quieting room. He added nothing about the blue stripes, nothing about the sea. The columns remained narrow, unforgiving. Truth was squeezed to fit the line, just as he had crushed the paper margin in Chapter 2 to make the vertebra fragment align. A shadow fell across the page. Mahon stood there. The prisoner had been unshackled for the moment, allowed to stretch his legs while the jury filed out, their faces pale and averted. He loomed over the desk, smelling of soap and stale tobacco, a sharp human scent that clashed violently with the underlying sweetness of the pot. He looked down at the ledger, then at Thorne. His eyes were flat, devoid of the irritation that had flickered moments before. The mask was back in place, polished and impenetrable. "Meticulous, aren't you?" Mahon said. His voice was conversational, light, as if they were discussing the weather or the price of coal. "Recording every scrap, every splinter." "It is my duty, Mr. Mahon." Thorne did not look up. He kept writing, the scratch of the pen a shield. The court requires an inventory. Inventory, Mahon tasted the word, rolling it around his mouth. Such a tidy term makes it all sound so organized, as if one can simply list the components of a life and sum them up at the bottom. He leaned closer, his breath warm against Thorne's ear. Did she tell you about the blouse, the blue stripes? Thorne's hands stopped. The ink pooled at the end of the stroke, a tiny black lake threatening to spill over the line. Miss Kaye identified the exhibit, that is all. She always did like the sea. Mahon straightened, adjusting his tie again, the gesture smooth now practiced. Foolish sentiment, clothes are just clothes, fabric, thread, buttons, they don't define the person. Surely you see that, Clark, you who reduce us all to weights and measures. You are mistaken. Thorne finally looked up, meeting the prisoner's gaze. The urge to strike out, to smear the ink across that smug face, surged through him, hot and violent. He suppressed it, channeling it into the grip on his pen. The button was not just fabric, it was a memory, and you cannot boil a memory away. Mahon's smile tightened at the corners, a crack in the veneer barely perceptible. Memories are unreliable things, they fade, they distort. Only what is written down remains, and I see you are very good at writing things down. He tapped the ledger with a manicured fingernail. But tell me, do you write down what you feel, or just what you see? I write what is required. Required by whom? Mahon stepped back, spreading his hands. By the law, by the judge, or by yourself, to make sense of the nonsense? He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. We are not so different, you and I both trying to impose order on a messy business. You with your ink, me with my methods. The comparison struck Thorne like a physical blow, leaving him breathless. He wanted to deny it, to scream that he was nothing like this man who had dismembered a woman and tried to dissolve her in acid. But the words stuck in his throat. Was he not complicit? By recording the remains, by categorizing the horror, was he not participating in the erasure? Turning Emily Kaye into data, into a case number, into a series of entries in a government file. Mr. Mahon, the bailiff's voice cut through the tension. Time to return to the cells. Mahon nodded, the moment of intimacy broken. He turned away, walking towards the door with a spring in his step, whistling a tuneless melody. He let the hallway swallow him without a backward glance. He did not need to. He had planted his seed of doubt, and it was already taking root in Thorne's mind, twisting the certainty of his duty into something questionable, something stained. Thorne watched him go, the figure disappearing into the corridor where the shadows were deep, and the air was thick with the scent of old stone and newer fear. He looked down at the ledger. The ink had dried, leaving a permanent mark on the page. Exhibit 4B1 button. He closed the book. The leather cover felt heavy, weighted with more than just paper. He tucked it under his arm, the edge pressing against his ribs, a constant reminder of the burden he carried. The room was empty now, save for the bailiff sweeping up the debris of the day's proceedings. The windows stood open, the curtains billowing in the wind, but the smell remained. It was in the drapes, in the floorboards, in the very fabric of the building. Thorne walked to the door, his boots clicking on the parquet floor. He stepped out into the corridor, the cool air relief against his heated skin. But as he moved towards the exit, towards the freedom of the street and the train back to Southwark, he knew it was an illusion. The scent had followed him. It clung to his coat, his hair, his skin. It was inside him now, woven into his very being. He pushed open the heavy doors of the assizes and stepped out onto the pavement. The wind hit him, strong and salty, carrying the cries of gulls and the distant rumble of the sea. It should have cleared his head. It should have washed the sweetness away. It did not. Thorne pulled his coat tighter, buttoning it against the chill, and began the walk to the station. The rhythm of his boots on the ground matched the ticking of the clock inside, the one that had stuck on the hour. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each step a second, each second a reminder. The possibility of innocence was dead. The certainty of guilt was absolute, and the woman in the pot was still waiting for someone to remember that she had liked the color of the sea. He reached the station platform just as the train pulled in, steam hissing from the engine, obscuring the view of the tracks. Thorne boarded, finding a seat in the corner, away from the other passengers. He placed the ledger on his lap, his hands resting on top of it, protecting it, guarding it. As the train lurched forward, gathering speed, the landscape blurred past the window. Fields, hedges, houses, all rushing by, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding in the courtroom, indifferent to the woman erased from existence. Thorne closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids offered no respite. The scent was there, the button was there, the sister's voice was there. She said the color matched the sea. The words echoed in his mind, looping, relentless. He opened his eyes, staring at his reflection in the glass. A pale man, a tired man, a man who had seen too much and recorded it all with perfect, sterile accuracy. He touched the ledger again. The leather was smooth under his fingertips, but beneath the surface, he could feel the roughness of the paper, the weight of the ink, the presence of the truth he had tried to capture and failed. The train rattled on, heading towards London, towards the fog and the smoke and the millions of lives unfolding in the dark. Thorne sat still, holding the ledger, carrying the smell, waiting for a journey that would never truly end. The lid lifted. A smell rolled out, thicker than the damp wool of the spectators' coats, heavier than the dust motes dancing in the shaft of morning light that cut across the dock. It was not the clean scent of wood smoke from a domestic hearth, nor the sharp tang of coal. This carried the greasy weight of burnt fat, sweet and cloying, sticking to the back of the throat like unswallowed medicine. Elias Thorne gripped his pen tighter, the wood digging into his callus, and waited for the nausea to pass. It did not. "Look closely, gentlemen," Sir Henry Curtis-Bennett said. His voice did not shout. It carved through the room, precise and cold as a scalpel. These fragments were recovered from the grate at Pevensey Bay, not buried in the shingle, not lost to the tide, burned. Thorne dipped his nib. The ink flowed black and viscous, pooling before he dragged it across the page. Exhibit 12, charred organic matter. He hesitated. The words felt insufficient, a child's description of a catastrophe. He added from fireplace. It changed nothing. The paper could not hold the odor, yet the smell seemed to rise from the ledger itself, merging with the carbolic soap he had used on his hands that morning until the two scents fought a losing war in his nostrils. Patrick Mahon sat still. He wore the same dark suit he had favored throughout the proceedings, the lapels brushed free of lint, the tie knotted with a symmetry that bordered on the obsessive. Earlier in the week, he had spoken of his flat with a prideful lilt, describing his habits of order, his dislike of clutter, as if cleanliness could absolve the blood on the floorboards. Now, facing the tray of blackened shards, his gaze slid past the evidence to anchor on his hands. He turned one over, examining the palm, then the other, as if checking for soot that only he could see. "Dr. Spilsbury," Curtis-Bennett continued, stepping aside to allow the pathologist room. "In your professional opinion, could this degree of combustion occur by accident, a slipped grate, a fallen ember?" "No," Spilsbury replied. The single word dropped into the silence without echo. The temperature required to reduce bone to this state implies sustained intent, a fire built to consume. Thorne wrote intent. He crossed it out immediately. Opinion, not fact. The rules of the court demanded neutrality, a sterile distance that turned horror into data. He wrote sustained heat instead. The nib scratched, a harsh insect noise against the quiet. Around him, the jury shifted. 12 men and women who had begun the week looking at Mahon with a degree of polite curiosity now sat rigid, their eyes fixed on the tray. One woman, seated at the end of the front row, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. She did not weep. Tears had no jurisdiction here. Mr. Justice Avery had made that clear on the second day. She simply pressed the linen harder, knuckles whitening, as if physically holding herself together against the urge to flee. Mahon adjusted his cuff. The movement was small, barely a twitch of the wrist, but Thorne saw it. It was the same gesture the prisoner had made when discussing his furniture, his routines, the tidy arrangement of his life. A reflex of control, but the control was slipping. The polished veneer of the gentleman scholar was cracking under the weight of the ash. There was nothing tidy about this, nothing domestic. The fragments were jagged, uneven, a chaotic scatter of destruction that defied Mahon's narrative of a respectful, if illegal, disposal. He had claimed he sought to hide the body to avoid scandal, to protect reputations. He had not spoken of burning flesh until it vanished into the air. "Did you find tissue?" Curtis-Bennett asked. "Residue, yes. Human. I cannot specify beyond organic origin," Spilsbury said. turning the tray slightly so the light caught the grey sheen of the powder. But the context is clear. Thorne stopped writing. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes moving from the tray to the dock. Mahon had stopped looking at his hands. He was staring at the wall behind the judge's bench, his expression blank, a mask of porcelain smoothed over scream. The irony sat heavy in Thorne's chest, a stone swallowed whole. Mahon had tried to erase Emily Kaye. He had boiled, cut, and burned her to remove her from the record, to leave no trace but a missing person poster on a police station wall. Yet here she was, more present than she had ever been in life. Every splinter of bone was measured, weighed, catalogued, and discussed by 12 strangers and a room full of reporters. Her absence had become the loudest thing in Sussex. "Mr. Thorne." The clerk flinched. Mr. Justice Avery sat high above the floor, his face a landscape of deep lines and stern judgment. He did not look angry, he looked tired. "My lord, ensure the record reflects the exhibit number correctly. We shall not have confusion on this point." "Yes, my lord." Thorne's voice sounded thin to his own ears, stripped of substance by the vastness of the room. He looked down at the page, Exhibit 12, he underlined it. The ink was still wet, shining darkly. He thought of the mother-of-pearl button from the blouse, the one fragment that had survived the fire intact. That small circle of shell had more identity than this pile of ash. It had a shape, a purpose. It had fastened a sleeve. These fragments had only destruction. Curtis-Bennett stepped back from the witness box, signaling the end of the examination. The bailiff moved forward to remove the tray. As he lifted it, the lid shifted, and another wave of that sweet, dead smell rolled out, touching the front row. The woman with the handkerchief closed her eyes. Mahon did not move. He kept staring at the wall, but his throat worked. He swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing against the stiff collar. Thorne capped his inkwell. The trial was nearing its end. The evidence was complete. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to burn. The state had gathered every scrap of Emily Kaye that could be found and placed it in the balance. Now the law would weigh it. He looked at Mahon again. The prisoner finally lowered his gaze, looking down at the dock rail. He ran a thumb along the wood, smoothing an imaginary rough spot. Tidiness. Even now, facing the ruin he had made, he sought to smooth the edges. Avery shuffled his papers. The sound was dry, like leaves skittering on stone. He picked up his spectacles, wiping the lenses with a silk cloth before settling them on the bridge of his nose. The courtroom held its breath, not in suspense, but in exhaustion. The air was stale, recycled through too many lungs, thick with the heat of too many bodies. "It is time," Avery said. His voice lacked the sharpness he had used with the witnesses. It was flat, drained of color. "I must instruct the jury on the points of law. You will listen closely. There is to be no interruption." Thorne opened the ledger to a fresh page. The paper was crisp, white, untouched by the grease of the evidence or the sweat of the crowd. He dipped his pen. The nib hovered over the line, waiting for the summing up to begin, waiting for the law to speak where the dead could not. The nib descended. Ink bled into the fiber, a black vein spreading across the white page, summing up. Thorne wrote the heading, the letters sharp, angular, demanding order where none existed. Below, Avery's voice began to weave the net. It was a dry sound, stripped of moisture, like wind moving through dead grass in November. "You are concerned solely with the facts as presented," Avery said. His gaze bypassed the prisoner entirely, fixing instead on the 12 people who held the power of life and death in their folded hands. "Speculation has no place here. Sentiment has no jurisdiction. You must decide whether the evidence proves, beyond reasonable doubt, that the prisoner intended to kill." Thorne's hand moved in time with the words, "intended to kill." The phrase felt clumsy, inadequate to capture the violence of a chisel against bone or the slow dissolution of flesh in acid. He pressed harder, the nib scratching, trying to force the ink to hold the weight of the truth. Around him, the courtroom settled into a heavy stillness. The air remained thick. The sweet odor of the burnt remains clinging to the wood paneling, seeping into the wool of the jurors' coats. It was a scent that would not wash out. It would travel home with them, into their parlors, their kitchens, clinging to the hems of their skirts and the cuffs of their trousers. Mahon sat very still. He had stopped smoothing the rail. His hands lay flat on the wood, palms down, fingers spread. He looked like a man waiting for a train that was late, checking a pocket watch that did not exist. There was no fear in the posture, only a rigid adherence to form. He had built his defense on tidiness, on the idea that accidents happen in messy lives, not in orderly ones. But the ash in the tray had been messy. The bones in the jar had been jagged. The law did not care about order, it cared about intent. Accident, Avery continued, the word dropping into the room like a stone into a well. The prisoner suggests accident. He suggests a mishap during a procedure he claims was consensual. You must weigh that against the extent of the concealment. One does not burn a body to hide an accident. One burns a body to hide a crime. Thorne paused, his wrist ached. The muscles in his forearm tightened, a knot of fatigue binding the bone. He flexed his fingers, the joints clicking softly. For a moment his gaze snagged on Mahon. The prisoner's eyes were fixed on the judge, but he was not seeing the man. He was seeing the logic of his own destruction. He had tried to make Emily Kaye vanish into the atmosphere, to turn her into smoke and scatter her on the wind. Instead, he had given her a permanence she never possessed in life. She was in every notebook, every transcript, every column of Thorne's ledger. She was in the air they breathed. Concealment, Thorne wrote the word. The ink pooled slightly at the cross of the T. He blotted it quickly, the grey paper lifting the excess. It was a futile gesture. The stain was already there, soaked into the pulp, just as the smell was soaked into the room, just as the memory was soaked into the minds of the 12 jurors. Mahon had wanted to erase her. He had succeeded only in etching her deeper. "Consider the tools," Avery said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The weight of the office carried it to the back of the gallery. A chisel, a knife, acid, these are not instruments of accident. They are instruments of purpose. You must decide if that purpose was murder. Thorne's pen flew now, chasing the judge's words. Instruments of purpose. The phrase echoed. He thought of the chisel in the evidence box, the wood of the handle stained dark where Mahon's hand had gripped it. He thought of the acid pot, the leaden weight of it. Purpose. Yes, there had been purpose in every blow, every pore. There had been a plan. The chaos of the remains was not the result of panic. It was the result of a man trying to fit a human being into a suitcase, into a pot, into a fireplace, trying to make her small enough to disappear. She would not disappear. Thorne looked down at his hands. They were stained with ink. A smudge of black lay under the nail of his index finger, stubborn, refusing to be washed away. He had scrubbed them with carbolic soap until the skin was raw, yet the grit remained. It was not dirt, it was the work. It was the accumulation of every death he had recorded, every weight measured, every bone catalogued. Emily Kaye was under his nail now. She was in the ledger. She was in the wood of the dock. "You will retire to consider your verdict," Avery said. The sentence landed, final as a hammer blow. "Take nothing with you but the evidence. Leave your emotions at the door." The bailiff stepped forward, his boots creaking on the floorboards. The jury rose. They moved slowly, stiffly, as if their joints were locked by the coldness of the instruction. The woman with the handkerchief tucked it into her sleeve. Her gaze slid past Mahon as if he was smoke. None of them met his eyes. They looked at the door, at the escape route, at the chance to breathe air that did not smell of burnt flesh. Thorne capped his pen. The click of the metal cap was loud in the sudden shuffle of movement. He closed the ledger. The leather cover creaked, a sound of finality. Inside, the pages were full. The inventory was complete. The summing up was recorded. There was nothing left to do but wait. Mahon stood. The guards moved in, flanking him, their hands hovering near his arms but not touching. He straightened his tie. It was a small movement, a flick of the wrist, but it was there. The vanity remained. Even now, facing the end, he sought to present a tidy appearance to the world. He turned towards the dock door, his step measured, precise. He did not stumble. He did not look back at the tray of ash. Thorne watched him go. The prisoner disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, swallowed by the stone throat of the court. The gallery began to murmur, the sound rising like steam. People reached for hats, for coats, for the comfort of the outside world. They wanted to leave. They wanted to forget. "Mr. Thorne." The clerk turned. Avery was gathering his papers, stacking them into a neat pile. He did not look up. He tapped the edge of the stack on the bench, aligning the corners perfectly. "My lord, ensure the transcript is prepared for the Home Office by morning. No delays." "It will be done, my lord." Avery nodded. He stood, his robes settling around him. He looked old, suddenly. The sternness slipped, revealing the fatigue beneath. He touched the bridge of his nose, rubbing the skin where the spectacles had pinched. For a second, his hand trembled. Then he turned and walked away, following the prisoner into the shadows. Thorne sat alone at the clerk's table. The courtroom was emptying. The light from the high windows was fading, the grey of the afternoon deepening into dusk. The smell remained. It hung in the still air, heavier now that the bodies were gone. He looked at the ledger. It lay closed, a black rectangle on the wood. Inside, Emily Kaye was reduced to weights and measures. She was ounces of bone, inches of hair, fragments of cloth. She was safe there, protected by the law. But she was not whole. Thorne stood. His legs felt heavy, filled with lead. He picked up the ledger, tucking it under his arm. The weight of it pressed against his ribs. He walked towards the door, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the panes. It would rain soon. The shingle would be wet, the pebbles dark and slick. He would walk home through the damp streets, the ledger under his arm, the smell of ash in his clothes. He reached the corridor. It was empty. The gas lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He paused, listening. Somewhere deep in the building, a door closed. A lock turned. The sound was small, but it echoed in the silence. Mahon was locked away. The jury was deliberating. The machine was grinding forward. Thorne tightened his grip on the ledger. The leather was cold against his side. He began to walk, the sound of his boots marking time on the stone, counting down the minutes until the verdict came. The clock above the bench did not tick. It held its breath. The great brass pendulum, usually a metronome for the court's slow digestion of horror, swung to the apex of its arc and stopped. Dust motes danced in the shaft of grey light cutting from the high window, frozen in suspension as if the air itself had turned to jelly. Thorne watched the second hand tremble against the numeral 12, a tiny silver spear unable to pierce the next minute. Silence is not empty, it has weight. It presses against the eardrums, thick and cloying like wet wool. Guilty. The foreman's voice cracked on the single word, dry as kindling snapping in a grate. The clock dropped. The pendulum swung back with a heavy, metallic clunk that echoed off the oak paneling, marking the precise second Patrick Mahon ceased to be a defendant and became a condemned man. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, up through the soles of Thorne's boots, settling in the marrow of his shins. It was the same stutter from the trial's opening, that same mechanical hesitation, but now it felt less like a fault and more like a judgment. The machine of the law had paused to load its gun. Mahon flinched. It was a small thing, a twitch of the shoulder, but Thorne saw it. The prisoner stood rigid in the dock, his face a mask of pale, waxy composure that had held firm through days of boiled bone and charred flesh. Now the mask slipped. His eyes, previously fixed on some distant point beyond the judge's head, darted to the side. Instinct took the wheel. His right hand jerked upwards, fingers curling towards his collar in that familiar, vain gesture of adjustment. He sought to straighten the silk tie, to smooth the crease, to impose order on the chaos unraveling around him. Tidiness. The word floated through Thorne's mind, unbidden and sour. The movement died before it began. The dock officer, a broad man with hands like cured hams, had anticipated the reflex. His grip tightened on Mahon's bound wrists, pinning them against the prisoner's ribs. The silk tie remained askew, a dark slash against the white shirt, crooked as a broken fence post. Mahon's fingers twitched against the restraint, grasping at nothing, unable to complete the ritual. He looked down at his own hands, bound tight with cord, and for the first time the vanity evaporated. What remained was a raw, animal confusion. He was a man who had tried to file a woman away in a suitcase, to boil her down to nothing, and now he could not even fix his own collar. Thorne looked down at his ledger. The book lay open on the desk, the pages filled with his tight, cramped script. Item 4, fragment of scapula. Weight 2 Oz. Item 5, lock of hair burnt. Weight negligible. He ran a thumb over the margin where the paper had buckled. Weeks ago he had pressed too hard with the nib, trying to force the numbers of a vertebra into the pre-printed column. The paper had crushed, wrinkling under the pressure of the ink, the fibers giving way to accommodate a shape they were not designed to hold. That was this, the whole trial. They had taken the messy, screaming reality of a woman beaten to death in a cottage by the sea, a woman whose remains were scattered across the shingle and boiled in a pot like stew, and they had tried to crush it into these neat, ruled lines. They had sanded down the edges of the horror until it fit the statute. Avery's voice, the barrister's rhetoric, the jury's deliberation, it was all just pressure applied to the page. Force the facts to align. Ignore the way the paper buckles. Ignore the smell. If the column is wide enough, the truth will fit. But the paper remembers the crush. The fibers stay broken. "My lord," the clerk of the court said, his voice thin, "the judgment." Avery did not hesitate. He pulled his spectacles down the bridge of his nose, peering over the rims with eyes that looked suddenly ancient, rimmed with red. "Patrick Mahon, you have been found guilty of the murder of Emily Kaye. The sentence of this court is that you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck until you are dead." The words landed with the dull thud of wet earth on a coffin lid. Mahon did not speak. He stared at the crooked tie, his chest heaving slightly beneath the restrained arms. The gallery behind Thorne erupted, a sudden rush of sound like a dam breaking. Hats were snatched up, coats rustled. Someone sobbed, a sharp, ugly noise that was quickly stifled. The bailiff stepped in, gripping Mahon's elbow, turning him away from the dock, away from the judge, away from the ledger that held the inventory of his crime. "Mr. Thorne." Avery's voice cut through the din. He was signing the warrant now, the scratch of the pen loud and aggressive against the wood. He did not look up. "The transfer papers for Wandsworth. They require your signature as witness to the chain of custody. The prisoner is to be moved within the hour." Thorne stood, his legs felt stiff, the joints gummed up with the day's stillness. "Yes, my lord." "And take the ledger. The Home Office will want the original inventory attached to the warrant. Every ounce must be accounted for, from the beach to the grave." Avery blotted the signature, the ink soaking into the fiber, permanent and black. He pushed the paper across the bench. It slid over the wood, stopping just at the edge, waiting for Thorne to claim it. Thorne reached out. His fingers brushed the warm paper, still damp from the judge's hand. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the death warrant, the thinness of the sheet belied by the finality of the words printed upon it. He tucked it beneath the ledger, the two documents pressing together, law and inventory bound in a single stack. Outside the high windows, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. Rain began to tap against the glass, a tentative rhythm that would soon become a deluge. The shingle at Pevensey would be slick and dark now, the stones grinding together under the wash of the tide. Somewhere out there, the rest of Emily Kaye might still be sinking into the mud, uncounted, unweighed, free of the columns. Thorne adjusted his grip on the books. The leather cover of the ledger dug into his ribs, a hard, unforgiving edge. He looked at Mahon being led towards the side door, the prisoner's head bowed, the tie still crooked, the vanity stripped away to reveal the hollow man beneath. The dock officer shoved him forward, not unkindly, but with a firmness that allowed no resistance. "Come along, Mr. Thorne," the bailiff said, holding the door open. "The van is waiting." Thorne nodded. He stepped away from the desk, leaving the empty space where the ledger had sat. The wood was marked with a faint rectangle of dust, the only proof that the book had ever been there. He walked towards the door, the rain drumming louder now, a chaotic rhythm that no clock could keep. The corridor beyond was dim, the gas lamps flickering in the draught. At the end of the hall, the heavy iron gate of the holding cells stood open, a dark mouth waiting to swallow the prisoner whole. Thorne tightened his hold on the warrant. The paper crinkled, a small, dry sound in the echoing hall. He had one last duty before the rain took him. He had to follow the man into the dark and ensure the paperwork survived the journey. The corridor air tasted of wet wool and old tobacco, a thick soup that clung to the back of the throat. Thorne walked. His boots clicked on the flagstones, a sharp counterpoint to the muffled roar still leaking from the courtroom behind him. The sound of justice being served, or perhaps just the sound of a crowd eager to get home before the rain truly broke. He kept his eyes on the back of Mahon's head. The prisoner moved with a strange, shuffling gait, the officers flanking him not dragging but steering, their hands like iron vices on upper arms that had once been so proud. Mahon stumbled, a loose stone in the path of a man who believed himself above such things. The officer on the left yanked him upright, a rough correction that sent Mahon's shoulder jerking against the restraint. "Watch your step," the officer grunted. Mahon said nothing. He was looking at his feet, or perhaps at the shadows stretching long and thin across the floor. The gas jets hissed overhead, casting a jaundiced light that made the skin of everyone it touched look sickly, drained of blood. Thorne tightened his grip on the ledger. The edges of the book bit into his palm, a grounding pain. He needed to focus. The chain of custody, that was the thing. If the paper trail broke, the whole edifice crumbled. A man could hang on a technicality or walk free because a clerk forgot to sign a column. It happened, not often, but enough to keep men like Thorne awake at night, tracing lines of ink in the dark. They reached the heavy iron gate. The keeper nodded, a silent acknowledgement, and swung the bar aside. The mechanism groaned, a deep metallic complaint that echoed off the stone walls. Beyond lay the holding cells, a row of dark mouths waiting to be filled. The smell changed here. The tobacco and wool vanished, replaced by the sharp, ammoniac sting of urine and the damp rot of unwashed bodies. It was the smell of waiting, of men suspended between the world they had known and the void they were about to enter. "In here," the lead officer said. He pushed Mahon into the first cell. It was small, barely 6 feet square, with a wooden bench fixed to the wall and a bucket in the corner. The bars were thick, painted black, the gaps narrow enough to deny any hope of escape, but wide enough to let the cold draft whistle through. Mahon turned. For a second, just a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. His eyes, wide and dark, scanned the cell, the officers, Thorne standing just outside the bars with his books. There was no dignity left. No pretense of tidiness, just an animal fear, raw and naked, stripped bare by the certainty of the rope. "Hands," the officer commanded. Mahon lifted them. The handcuffs clicked, a sound as final as a closing book. The officer tested the links, giving a sharp tug to ensure they held. Satisfied, he stepped back. "You'll stay here until the van is ready," he said. "Don't make a fuss. It'll only make it harder." Mahon nodded, a small, jerky movement. He sat on the bench, his back straight, trying to reclaim some shred of the posture that had defined him in court. He smoothed his trousers, a futile gesture against the creases and the dust of the journey. Then he looked at his tie. It was still crooked, the knot loose and askew against his collar. His hands twitched, rising instinctively towards the silk, fingers curling as if to straighten the fabric, to impose order on the chaos of his appearance. But the cuffs caught him. The metal rang against metal, a sharp, mocking chime. His hands fell back to his lap, useless. He stared at them, at the steel that bound him, and something in his face collapsed. Not into tears, Sir Avery would have approved of that at leaster, but into a terrible, hollow stillness. Thorne watched. He felt the ledger heavy in his arms, the weight of it pressing against his chest. Inside those pages, Emily Kaye was reduced to ounces and fragments. A scapula here, a lock of hair there, neat rows of data that added up to a life extinguished. And now Mahon too was becoming data. A prisoner number, a time of execution, a location. The law demanded it. The system required this reduction. You could not hang a man for the smell of boiling flesh or the memory of a mother's grief. You needed facts, you needed weights, you needed the paper to align. But the paper remembered the crush. He thought of the margin in his log, the way the fibers had buckled under the pressure of his pen when he tried to force the vertebra into the column. The paper had held, but it was damaged, permanently creased, just like this. The trial had pressed down hard, trying to squeeze the horror of Pevensey Bay into the neat boxes of the indictment, and it had worked. They had a verdict. They had a sentence, but the fibers were broken. The truth was still there, lurking in the wrinkles, refusing to be smoothed away. "Mr. Thorne." The officer was looking at him, an eyebrow raised. "The transfer form, you need to sign for the prisoner's effects before we move him." Thorne blinked. The corridor swam for a moment, the gaslight flickering in his peripheral vision. He stepped forward, balancing the ledger on one arm while he fumbled in his pocket for his pen. The metal was cold against his fingers. He uncapped it, the nib gleaming in the dim light. "Here," the officer said, holding out a clipboard. A sheet of paper was clipped to it, the lines stark and black. "Just sign at the bottom, confirming receipt of personal items for storage pending the conclusion." Thorne looked at the line. Personal effects, One suit, one shirt, one tie, one pair of boots. No mention of the blood, no mention of the lies, just clothes, objects that could be bagged and tagged. He pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed, dark and wet, forming his signature. Elias Thorne, the letters looped and crossed, familiar and meaningless. He was witnessing the final inventory, the last entry before the account was closed. He handed the clipboard back. The officer took it, tucking it under his arm with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. "Right," the officer said. "We'll wait for the transport. Shouldn't be long." Thorne nodded. He stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the corridor. The cell door remained open, a black rectangle framing Mahon sitting on the bench. The prisoner was not looking at them anymore. He was staring at the wall, his head bowed, the crooked tie a splash of color in the monochrome gloom. He looked small, smaller than he had in the dock, smaller than the sum of his crimes. The rain outside intensified. It hammered against the high barred windows, a relentless drumming that drowned out the distant traffic of Lewes. The sound filled the space between the bars, filling the silence that Mahon refused to break. Thorne shifted his weight. His feet ached. The ledger felt heavier now, as if the ink inside had turned to lead. He thought of the van waiting outside, the engine idling, ready to carry the prisoner to Wandsworth, to the end. And he would go with it. He had to. The Home Office required the original inventory. The chain of custody had to be unbroken, from the beach to the grave, every ounce accounted for. He tightened his grip on the book, feeling the texture of the cover, the wear on the corners. It was his burden now, to carry the record, to ensure that nothing was lost, not even the things that could not be weighed. A draft swept down the corridor, chilling the sweat on his neck. The gas jet above the cell flickered, dipped, then burned bright again, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone. Mahon did not flinch. He sat perfectly still, a statue of a man waiting for the world to finish with him. Thorne watched the rise and fall of the prisoner's chest, the slow, shallow breaths of someone holding themselves together by a thread. The officer checked his watch, a silver onion dangling from a fob. "Any minute now," he muttered, more to himself than to Thorne. Thorne nodded again. He had no words. What was there to say? The procedure was clear. The path was laid out. He just had to walk it. He adjusted the ledger under his arm, ensuring the warrant was secure, tucked safely between the covers. The paper crinkled softly, a dry whisper in the damp air. Somewhere a door slammed. Footsteps approached, heavy and rhythmic, echoing towards them from the direction of the entrance. The van, perhaps, or the driver coming to collect his charge. Thorne straightened his spine, preparing to move, to follow the procession into the rain. The journey to Wandsworth was short in miles, but long in consequence. He took a breath, tasting the urine and the damp, and waited for the signal to go. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The iron gate at the end of the hall creaked open once more. The iron gate swung wide. Two men entered. One wore the uniform of the prison transport, a heavy greatcoat damp at the shoulders. The other carried a lantern that cast swinging shadows against the wet stone. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who handled cargo rather than people, boots clumping on the flagstones, indifferent to the smell of urine that hung in the corridor like a curtain. The driver, a broad man with a moustache stiffened by rain, stopped before the officer and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Ready as he." "Waiting," the officer said. He jerked his chin towards the open cell. "Judge signed the warrant 10 minutes past. We need the clerk to accompany the papers. Home Office rules." The driver shifted his gaze to Thorne. His eyes were pale, watery, devoid of curiosity. "You're the clerk." "Yes." Thorne shifted the ledger against his ribs. The corners dug into his elbow. "I have the inventory." "Best keep it dry then. Van's open-topped until we get the canvas up. Rain's coming down hard enough to drown a rat." The driver spat on the floor, a dark globule that landed near Thorne's shoe. "Don't want the records sodden. Causes paperwork nightmares." "Understood." Thorne stepped forward, away from the wall. The movement stirred the stagnant air, bringing the scent of wet wool and tobacco smoke from the driver's coat. He glanced once more into the cell. Mahon remained on the bench, his posture unchanged, though the light from the lantern now caught the silver buckle of his belt, flashing briefly before the shadow swallowed it again. The prisoner's hands lay palm up on his knees, exposed and useless. The tie remained crooked, a dark slip of silk against the white collar, mocking the earlier attempt at adjustment. It was a small thing, a trivial detail, yet it anchored Thorne to the floor. He thought of the ledger tucked against his ribs. The pages inside were filled with rows of numbers, weights, measurements. Each entry represented a piece of a woman, a femur, a tooth, a lock of hair. He had spent weeks forcing these fragments into columns designed for coal shipments or textile orders, crushing the margins when the numbers refused to align, just as the law had crushed the messy horror of Pevensey Bay into the neat boxes of the indictment. The paper had buckled then. It had creased. And now, looking at Mahon's bound hands and the crooked tie, Thorne saw the same crease running through the entire proceeding. They had fit the crime to the law, not the law to the crime. "Come on then," the driver said. He turned on his heel, the lantern swinging wildly, casting long, distorted shapes against the walls. "Don't dawdle, we've got a schedule." Thorne followed. His legs felt stiff, the joints resisting movement after so long standing still. He walked past the open cell door, close enough to hear the rasp of Mahon's breathing, shallow and rhythmic, like a bellows working low on fuel. He did not turn his head. To look would be to acknowledge the man inside the shell, and the procedure demanded he acknowledge only the prisoner number, the charge, the sentence. The humanity had been excised during the trial, stripped away layer by layer until only the legal entity remained. Just like the ledger. They reached the outer door of the assizes. The rain hammered against the wood, a relentless drumming that vibrated through the frame. The officer unlocked the bolt, a heavy clunk of metal on metal, and pushed the door open. A gust of wind drove rain into the corridor, spraying Thorne's face with cold droplets that tasted of soot and sea salt. Outside, the van waited, a black box on wheels, the engine coughing into life as the driver climbed into the cab. "Get in the back with him," the officer shouted over the wind. He held out a sealed envelope, the wax red and glossy. "Give this to the governor at Wandsworth, personal delivery. Don't let it out of your sight." Thorne took the envelope. The wax was still warm, and the ledger. "Keep that too, chain of custody." The officer stepped back into the shelter of the doorway, shielding his eyes from the rain. "You're the witness, Thorne, from start to finish. Make sure the record stays intact." "Start to finish." Thorne repeated the words. They sounded hollow, stripped of meaning by the wind. "Move," the driver yelled from the cab. Thorne climbed into the back of the van. The interior was dark, smelling of oil and damp canvas. Mahon sat on the bench opposite, shackled now at the ankles as well as the wrists, his face obscured by the shadows. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement, just the presence of another body in the confined space, sharing the air as the vehicle lurched forward. The wheels churned over the wet cobbles, vibrating through the floorboards and up into Thorne's bones. He placed the ledger on his lap, the envelope on top. His hands rested on the cover, feeling the texture of the material, the slight warping where the damp air had touched it. He thought of the margin in his logbook, the way the fibers had buckled under the pressure of his pen. The paper had held, but it was damaged, permanently creased, just like this. The trial had pressed down hard, trying to squeeze the horror of Pevensey Bay into the neat boxes of the indictment, and it had worked. They had a verdict, they had a sentence, but the fibers were broken. The truth was still there, lurking in the wrinkles, refusing to be smoothed away. The van hit a pothole. Thorne bounced, his shoulders striking the metal wall. He steadied the ledger with one hand, the other gripping the envelope. Outside, the lights of Lewes blurred past the slats in the canvas, streaks of yellow and white that merged into the grey darkness. They were leaving the town, leaving the court, moving towards the prison where the final entry would be made. Mahon shifted. The chains rattled, a sharp metallic sound that cut through the engine noise. He lifted his head, looking across the narrow space at Thorne. His eyes were dark, unreadable, reflecting the faint light from the slats. For a second, Thorne expected him to speak, to offer some final justification, some plea for tidiness. But Mahon said nothing. He simply looked at the ledger on Thorne's lap, then back at Thorne's face, before lowering his gaze to his bound hands. The gesture was final, an admission that the inventory was complete. Thorne opened the ledger. He needed to check the last entry, to ensure the ink was dry. The pages rustled, dry and brittle in the damp air. He ran his finger down the column of weights, past the vertebrae, the ribs, the fragments of clothing. Every ounce accounted for, every splinter listed. It was perfect, accurate, sterile. And it was a lie. Not in the numbers were true, the weight of a bone did not lie, but the sum of the parts did not equal the whole. Emily Kaye was not 3 pounds of bone and a button, she was a voice, a memory, a presence that had been boiled away in a pot and then filed away in a cabinet. Thorne closed the book. The sound was like a gunshot in the confined space. He looked at Mahon. The prisoner was staring at the wall again, his profile sharp against the swinging light. Thorne tightened his grip on the ledger. He was the keeper of the record, the guardian of the facts. But as the van rumbled towards London, carrying the condemned man to his end, Thorne understood that the true weight was not in the pages. It was in the silence between the entries, the things that could not be weighed. The rain intensified, hammering against the canvas roof, drowning out the engine, drowning out the chains. Thorne sat back, pressing the ledger against his chest, and watched the shadows dance on the walls. The journey had begun. There was no turning back. The water arrived cold and hard, striking the palms with a force that numbed the skin before the soap could even lather. Thorne worked the yellow bar of carbolic into the creases of his knuckles, grinding the grit until the friction burned. Yet the sensation of shingle remained lodged beneath the quick of his nails where no brush could reach. It had been there since Pevensey, since the crate arrived, a permanent residue of the coast that refused to dissolve in London tap water. He scrubbed harder. Skin reddened, raw patches opening where the epidermis gave way to the demand for cleanliness, but the grey specks held fast, embedded deep in the whorls of his fingerprints as though they belonged to the bone itself. A warder leaned against the brickwork nearby, smoking a cigarette that smelled of damp tobacco and impatience, watching the clerk attack his own hands with a violence usually reserved for enemies. "Gate closes in 10, Mr. Thorne." The voice was flat, devoid of urgency, merely stating a fact of the prison's rhythm that continued regardless of the death just administered within the walls. Thorne did not look up, keeping his eyes fixed on the swirl of grey water draining into the iron grate below his feet. "Nearly done. Governor says the ledger goes to the Home Office by noon. Don't want it sitting in your office, gathering dust, while you play at hygiene." Thorne rinsed his hands under the stream, watching the suds turn pink before vanishing into the drain, and knew the warder was right about the ledger but wrong about the dust. No amount of washing would remove the weight of the book he had carried from Lewes, nor the entries written in ink that felt heavier than the paper could support. He turned the tap off. The sudden cessation of noise left a ringing in the ears, a high thin note that vibrated against the skull without ever settling into a hum. Drying his hands on a coarse towel, Thorne rubbed the fabric back and forth until the skin strung, trying to abrasive away the memory of the acid pot, the boiled fragments, the mother-of-pearl button that had survived the fire while the woman had not. It was futile. The stain was not on the surface. It lived in the marrow, in the space between the vertebrae he had weighed and recorded with such meticulous care. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Clark." "Just the inventory." "Same thing in here." The warder flicked his ash onto the wet pavement, where it sizzled and died instantly. "Best be moving, fog's coming in thick off the river." Thorne tucked the towel into his pocket, feeling the dampness seep through his coat to chill his thigh, and stepped away from the basin. The prison yard stretched out before him, a grey expanse of cobbles and high walls that seemed to lean inward, pressing the air out of the space until breathing felt like labor. He walked towards the gate, his boots clicking on the stones, the sound sharp and lonely in the stillness of the morning. People would expect relief. A man in his position, having witnessed the conclusion of such a notorious trial, should feel a sense of closure now that the state had exacted its pound of flesh from the murderer. They would assume the ledger was closed, the account settled, the books balanced. But Thorne knew better. The ledger was never closed. It merely waited for the next name, the next weight, the next column of figures that pretended to quantify a life ended in violence. He reached the gate and paused, looking back at the block where the execution had taken place. Nothing moved. No sound escaped the thick stone. Yet he could feel the vibration of what had happened there, a tremor in the ground that had nothing to do with machinery and everything to do with the sudden absence of a soul. Closing up, the warder moved to the laver. Thorne stepped out onto the pavement, the London fog wrapping around his shoulders like a wet wool blanket, obscuring the street lamps and blurring the edges of the buildings across the road. He adjusted his grip on the leather satchel containing the ledger, feeling the hard corners press against his ribs, a constant reminder of the duty he had fulfilled and the humanity he had sacrificed in the process. A motorcar idled near the curb, exhaust fumes mixing with the mist, and as the vapor shifted, Thorne saw a figure standing by the rear door. It was Mr. Justice Avery. The judge wore his heavy black coat and a bowler hat pulled low, shielding his face from the damp air, but his posture was not the rigid, upright stance he had maintained throughout the trial. Avery held a handkerchief in one hand, white against the dark wool, and was wiping his palms with a slow, repetitive motion that suggested a need to remove something invisible. His hands trembled, just slightly, a betrayal of the nerves he had kept so tightly leashed while rebuking spectators for weeping in his court. Thorne stopped walking, hidden by the fog, watching the judge struggle with a stain that no carbolic soap could touch. The judge looked up, catching Thorne's eye through the grey swirl, and for a second the mask slipped entirely. There was no authority in that gaze, no legal wisdom, only a raw, exposed horror that mirrored the clerk's own internal reckoning. Avery nodded, a jerky movement, then turned and climbed into the car, shutting the door against the world. Thorne stood alone on the pavement. The car pulled away, tail lights fading into the mist, leaving him with the ledger and the cold damp seeping into his bones. He looked down at his hands again. They were clean, scrubbed raw, pink and stinging, but the grit remained under the nails, invisible now but present, a permanent record of the shingle where Emily Kaye had died. He began to walk. The fog swallowed the sound of his boots, muffling the city until it felt as though he were walking through the Crumbles itself, the shingle shifting underfoot with every step. He knew he would go back to Southwark. He would lock the ledger in the cabinet. He would wash his hands again tonight and tomorrow and every day for the rest of his life. It would not matter. The dirt was inside. A bus emerged from the mist, headlights cutting 2 yellow cones through the grey, and Thorne stepped aside to let it pass, pressing his back against the cold brick of the prison wall. The engine roared, shaking the ground, vibrating through the soles of his shoes and up into his teeth, a mechanical thrum that drowned out thought but could not silence the memory of the weight of bone in his hand. He pushed off the wall and continued walking, the satchel weighing down his side like a stone, carrying the truth that the world preferred to file away. The ledger lay open on the desk, the page stark white under the gas jet, waiting for the final stroke of the pen. Thorne sat in the wooden chair that had worn smooth at the arms from 30 years of clerks shifting their weight, trying to find a position that eased the ache in the lower back. Outside, the London fog pressed against the windowpane, a thick yellow broth that swallowed the street lamps and turned the world beyond the glass into a shapeless void. He dipped the nib into the inkwell, watching the black liquid cling to the steel, heavy and viscous, before lifting it to the paper. Disposal of remains. The words looked innocent enough, neat loops of copperplate that anyone might write when ordering coal or recording a birth. They did not scream. They did not smell of acid or burnt hair. They sat on the page with a terrifying civility, pretending that what they described was a matter of routine administration rather than the final erasure of a human being. Thorne hesitated, the nib hovering a fraction of an inch above the line, his hand steady despite the tremor that had taken hold of his legs hours ago at the prison gate. He wrote the date, 9th August 1924. He wrote the location, Wandsworth Prison. He wrote the time, 0900 hours. Each entry was a nail in a coffin made of paper, sealing the facts away from the messy reality of flesh and grief. The law demanded precision. It required that every ounce be accounted for, every fragment logged, so that the state could say with absolute certainty that the debt had been paid in full. There was no column for the mother-of-pearl button Miss Kaye had worn on her favorite blouse, the one that had survived the fire while she had not. There was no space to record the way her sister's voice had cracked in the witness box, or the specific shade of grey the sky had been over Pevensey Bay when the tide first gave up its secret. Those things did not fit the grid. They spilled over the margins, unquantifiable and therefore irrelevant to the official record. Thorne pressed the nib down, forcing the ink to flow onto the fiber of the page. Remains interred in unconsecrated ground within prison boundaries. The scratch of the pen sounded loud in the small office, a dry rasping noise like a beetle dragging itself across wood. He finished the sentence, added the full stop, and set the pen down in the rest. The ink glistened wetly for a moment before sinking into the paper, turning from a shiny black to a dull, matte finish that looked as though it had always been there. It was done. The inventory was complete. Emily Kaye had been weighed, measured, boiled, burned, and buried, and now she was nothing more than a line item in a government ledger, filed away in a cabinet that would eventually be locked and forgotten. He reached out and closed the book. The cracked Morocco binding felt cool under his palm, smooth and unyielding, hiding the horror contained within its pages. For a long moment, he simply sat there, his hand resting on the spine, listening to the silence of the room. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a place where too many secrets had been spoken and then carefully unspoken, buried under layers of procedure and protocol. The gas jet hissed softly, a steady blue flame that cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, making the stacks of files look like towering monoliths ready to topple over and crush him. Thorne stood up, the chair scraping against the floorboards with a shriek that made him flinch. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass, looking out into the fog. Somewhere out there, the city was moving on. Buses were rumbling along the roads, people were buying evening papers, couples were walking home from the pictures, laughing and talking about trivial things that had nothing to do with acid pots or dismembered bones. The world did not stop for murder. It did not pause for grief. It simply absorbed the shock, digested the scandal, and excreted it as yesterday's news, leaving no trace behind except in the minds of those who had seen too much. He thought of Avery wiping his hands in the mist, the trembling gesture that had betrayed the judge's own complicity in this machinery of death. They were all part of it. The police who had dug through the shingle, the doctors who had boiled the flesh from the bone, the jury who had nodded solemnly as the evidence was displayed, the hangman who had adjusted the noose with professional care. And him, especially him. He had been the one to write it all down, to give the brutality a shape and a structure, to make it legible. Without his ledger, the crime would have been a chaos of senseless violence. With it, it became a case file, a statistic, a thing that could be understood and then dismissed. By reducing her to weights and measures, he had finished the work Mahon had started. Mahon had tried to erase her physically, to scatter her across the landscape until she was gone. Thorne had erased her spiritually, turning her tragedy into administrative data that could be filed and forgotten. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow, doubling him over slightly as he gripped the windowsill for support. His knuckles turned white, the skin stretching tight over the bone, but he barely felt the pain. It was a terrible thing to be so efficient, to do one's duty with such perfect accuracy that the humanity of the victim was lost in the transcription. He had wanted to bear witness. He had thought that by recording every detail, by refusing to look away from the horror, he was honoring her memory. But now, standing in the dim light of his office with the closed ledger on the desk behind him, he realized the truth. He had not honored her, he had processed her. He had taken the unique, singular tragedy of Emily Kaye and flattened it into a form that fit the requirements of the state. Thorne turned away from the window and walked back to the desk. He picked up the ledger, feeling its weight in his hands. It was heavier than it should have been, dense with the accumulated gravity of everything it contained. He clamped the book tight against his ribs, locking it there with the crook of his elbow, and blew out the gas jet. The room plunged into darkness, the shadows swallowing the desk, the chair, the stacks of files, until nothing remained but the faint glow of the street lamps filtering through the fog outside. He moved towards the door, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor, and unlocked it. The corridor beyond was empty, the other clerks long gone to their homes and their suppers, leaving him alone with the silence and the book. He stepped out and pulled the door shut, the click of the latch sounding final in the stillness. Walking down the hallway, the sound of his own breathing seemed too loud, a harsh rhythm that clashed with the quiet of the building. He reached the outer door and pushed it open, stepping out into the night. The fog had thickened, wrapping around him instantly, damp and cold, seeping through his coat to chill the skin beneath. He pulled his collar up against the dampness and began to walk, the ledger tucked securely under his arm. The streets were empty, the cobblestones slick with moisture, reflecting the dim orange glow of the lamps in distorted patches of light. Thorne walked without direction, letting his feet carry him forward, one step after another, into the grey expanse of the city. He knew he would go home. He would place the ledger on the shelf. He would wash his hands again, scrubbing them with soap and water until the skin was raw. But he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like the cold fog, that it would make no difference. The stain was not on his skin. It was in the way he saw the world now, in the way he understood that justice was not a restoration of balance, but merely another form of accounting. The true horror was not the murder itself, nor the brutality of the act, nor even the pain Emily Kaye had suffered in her final moments. The true horror was the ease with which the world filed it away. The speed with which the ledger was closed, the gas jet extinguished, the door locked, and the fog allowed to swallow everything whole. He turned a corner, the sound of his boots fading into the mist, carrying the private knowledge that no amount of washing could ever cleanse. The Shingle Witness is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Crumbles murders. Patrick Mahon. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.